Tonight, we'll listen to 3 timeless folk tales. Let your thoughts grow quiet as we begin. In a green valley folded between long blue mountains, where sunlight arrived late and lingered lovingly on the terraces, there lived a girl of 12 named Leora, who had grown up believing that time itself walked more slowly there than anywhere else in the world. It was not a foolish belief, nor even an uncommon one among the people of the valley. The eastern ridge was high and broad, and in the early hours it held back the dawn as if dawn were a shawl caught on its shoulder. Morning therefore came gradually. First the upper snows brightened. Then the larch forest turned from black to deep green. Then the stone roofs of the highest sheep houses caught a pale wash of silver. Only much later did the village itself receive the sun, and when it did, the light slid over the roofs and orchard walls with such leisure that even the busiest hand seemed to soften a little beneath it. The valley floor was narrow, but its sides widened into patient shelves of land cut into terraces by many generations of careful labour. There were apricot trees and walnut groves, herb plots and little vineyards, barley strips on the sunnier slopes, and hay meadows higher up where bells on the grazing goats sounded like water striking glass. Stone channels carried meltwater from the mountain stream into cisterns and garden rills. Footpaths and mule tracks crossed the terraces in measured zigzags. The houses in the village were built of grey stone with dark timber galleries, and most had deep eaves under which strings of onions, red peppers, dried mint, and bunches of mountain thyme hung in the turning air. In spring the whole valley smelled of damp soil, blossom, wool drying after rain, and wood smoke softened by distance. In summer it smelled of resin, warm stone, beeswax, honeycomb, apricots laid out on reed trays, and the clean mineral breath of snowmelt. In autumn there came the scents of crushed walnut husks, drying hay, apples in storage lofts, and pressed grape skins in clay tubs. In winter the air thinned to frost, pine, and the sweet dusty smell of grain sacks brought up from the cellar. Because the valley was tucked away from the larger roads, people there kept older habits longer than people in the plains towns. They still measured cloth by the elbow and grain by the scoop basket. They still used wooden rakes worn silky by generations of hands. They still patched copper kettles instead of throwing them aside. And though a metal-faced clock had been mounted in the square in Leora's father's childhood, many villagers trusted shadows, bells, birds, and the feel of the air on the back of the hand more than they trusted the clock's stiff black hands. So when Leora said that time moved slowly in the valley, no one laughed. Her grandmother would only say, "It moves at a pace that can hear itself," and stir the barley pot with the same patience she gave to every other task. Leora lived in a narrow stone house with a steep roof and a carved wooden balcony that looked over a lane of fig trees and wash lines. She lived there with her father, who kept bees on the lower terraces and mended hive boxes in winter, with her grandmother who spun wool, dried herbs, and remembered everything that had happened in the valley, except the places where she had set down her spectacles, and with her little brother Tovin, who was 6 and lived in a state of almost constant astonishment, as if each spoon, pebble, and goat hoof were a remarkable event deserving fresh wonder. Leora's mother had died when Tovin was still a baby, and because grief had settled into the house softly rather than loudly, the family had learned to live around it the way people in the valley lived around a boulder too old and too settled to move. There were moments when the absence of her mother felt sudden, like a draught under the door. There were other moments when it felt woven into the house, as thoroughly as the smell of rosemary or beeswax. Her father still kept her mother's apricot wood comb in a small bowl on the shelf by the lamp. Her grandmother still folded linen the way her mother had taught her. Tovin, who knew her only through stories, asked sometimes whether a laugh had sounded more like water or more like wind chimes, and no one ever found quite the right answer. Their days had a pleasant order. Before breakfast, Leora carried water from the cistern and scattered husks to the hens. Her father checked the hives or prepared wax for candles. Her grandmother turned drying herbs or carded wool by the window. Tovin followed whichever person looked busiest, and therefore most likely in his opinion to need unhelpful advice. In the afternoons there were apricots to sort, baskets to mend, honey jars to seal with cloth and twine, comb frames to scrape, or errands up and down the terraces. In the evenings, when the western ridge held the sun longer than one thought possible, the family sat sometimes on the balcony listening to the faint bells from the upper meadows and the lower, fuller note of the stream moving through its stone channel beyond the willows. It was from that balcony that Leora first began to notice the old woman. At dawn, before the village had fully opened its shutters, a small lantern would appear at the far end of the lane and move upward toward the eastern slope. It did not take the common market path, nor the chapel steps, nor the orchard road used by mule trains. Instead, it passed behind the disused grain loft, slipped through a narrow gap in an old retaining wall, and vanished where a neglected stair of stone once climbed toward the upper terraces and beyond them, somewhere higher and older, into the hush of the eastern slope. At first, Leora thought she had imagined it. Dawn in the valley often softened edges and made distances seem uncertain, but the light appeared again the next morning, and the next, always at nearly the same hour, always moving with the same unhurried steadiness. Sometimes it glowed in mist, sometimes it shone clear in cold blue air. Once, after a light summer rain, it trembled in droplets hanging from the fig leaves so that the whole lane seemed briefly strung with little amber beads. "Who is that?" Leora asked one morning, standing with her water pail halfway up the steps. Her grandmother, who was picking leaves from a tray of drying sage, did not look up. "That would be Damisem." "Who is Damisem?" Her grandmother lifted a shoulder. "Who she's always been." Leora frowned. Her grandmother's answers were often beautiful and rarely sufficient. Her father, hearing from the hive yard, added, "She kept the valley hours when I was young." "The valley has a clock," said Leora. "The valley has many things," said her father. "Not all of them are trusted equally." That only made her more curious. The old woman's name, Leora learned by asking others, was Isem Vale. She was 81 years old and lived alone in a small house above the walnut press, where the lane bent and the shade came early. She had once been the keeper of the House of Hours, though younger villagers spoke the title as though it belonged to an old song no one quite remembered all the verses to. She had no husband now, and no children in the village, and some said she had once had a brother who carried bells and records for the water channels. Some said she had spent years tending the upper meadows and the small noon shrine beyond them. Some said she could tell the time by the smell of sun on stone. That last claim seemed unlikely, even in a valley friendly to old stories. Yet Leora found herself believing it might be true. One dawn in midsummer, when the apricots had just begun to soften, and the bees were so busy the orchard hummed from morning until dusk, Leora rose earlier than usual and stood in the lane before the lantern appeared. The sky above the ridge was pearl grey. Swallows dipped low over the fig leaves. The world felt not yet awake, but on the edge of it. When the lantern came, it was nearer than she expected. Damisem was slight and upright. Wrapped in a dark blue wool cloak faded almost to slate. Her hair, braided and coiled low, was the colour of the moon when it first rises. She carried a square horn-paned lantern in one hand, and a staff of polished rowan in the other. The lantern light showed a lined face, neither stern nor soft, but weathered into attention. Her eyes were grey and very clear. She stopped when she saw Leora standing in the lane. "You are in the middle of the morning," Dame Sem said. Leora had planned a better beginning than that. "I wanted to ask where you go." "Up." Leora hesitated. "Every day?" "Not every day. Only the days that arrive." The old woman's voice was dry but not unkind. A sparrow hopped on the wall beside them and shook dew from its feathers. Somewhere behind the houses a shutter opened. Leora swallowed and tried again. "What is the house of hours?" At that, the old woman looked at her a little more fully. "A place above the village where people once remembered that time is a useful servant and a poor master." Leora did not fully understand that, which made her want to understand it very much. "May I see it?" "Perhaps. When?" "When your father agrees and when you can climb without demanding that the mountain become shorter." Leora nearly smiled. "I wouldn't." Dame Sem lifted one white eyebrow, a gesture that suggested old people knew more about the impatience of the young than the young like to imagine. "Then ask at supper, not with pleading, but with sense." She stepped around Leora and continued toward the narrow gap in the retaining wall. The lantern moved after her, and then both disappeared into the old stairway beyond. At supper, Leora asked with sense, or what she hoped was sense. Her father listened while sealing the cloth cover on a honey jar with a dab of wax from the spoon. Her grandmother tore barley bread and considered the matter with an inward look. Tovin asked whether the house of ours had clocks on every wall, and whether birds lived inside them. "It has no birds in the clocks, because it has no clocks," said Leora. "You haven't seen it," Tovin pointed out with the great severity of the young. "Isem Vale," said her father after a while. "If she invited you, she means to put you to work. I don't mind. That is because you have not yet felt what kind of work old mountain steps ask of your knees." "I still want to go," her grandmother nodded slowly. "Let her." "There is good in learning places the valley once used to know." Her father looked from the honey jar to Leora. "You will listen. You will not hurry ahead on the stair. If Dame Sem tells you a stone is loose, you will believe her before it proves itself. If weather turns, you come down at once." "I will." He set the jar aside. "Then go." Dawn seemed to arrive more slowly the next morning, though that may only have been because Leora woke 3 times before it came. At last the sky softened and she slipped from her bed, pulled on her wool stockings, tied her boots, and wrapped a narrow shawl over her shoulders. Her grandmother had left her a heel of bread and a small cloth parcel of goat cheese on the table. Beside it sat a brass flask filled with mint tea. Dame Sem was waiting in the lane. This time, beyond her lantern and staff, she carried a coil of rope, a flat shovel, and a satchel that seemed full of hard, useful things. Leora noticed, with a sudden nervousness, that the old woman intended more than a stroll. They began through the gap in the retaining wall. The stair beyond had once been substantial. That was evident at once. It climbed between low stone sides built to hold the slope, and though moss filled some joints and grasses grew in cracks, the steps themselves were broad and well laid. In places they had been half buried by washed earth and fallen leaves. In other places roots of wild thyme and creeping strawberry trailed over them. The path turned sharply after every dozen steps or so, making a slow ascent through fig shade, then between old apricot terraces, then into a belt of silver birch where the ground smelled cool and faintly of mushrooms even in high summer. "What was this road?" Leora asked after the first long turn. "The Dawn Stair," said Dame Sem, "also called the Upper Measure. Before that, in my grandmother's day, the Bell Rise." "Why so many names?" "Because useful places gather names the way wool gathers burrs." The answer made Leora smile, though her breathing was already less tidy than she preferred. Damisem climbed without haste and without pause, placing the ferrule of her staff lightly and precisely on the step ahead. She seemed not to conquer the stair, but to know it. They passed a broken bench stone under a walnut tree, then a narrow rill crossing where water from a side spring had once been channeled neatly under the path through clay pipe, and now wandered over the edge in a dark thread. Dem Isam stopped there first. "What do you see?" she asked. "A little water crossing. What else?" Leora looked harder. The stone below the trickle was stained deeper green. The edge of the stair had softened. Damp moss had eaten into the mortar between two side stones. The water should go under, not over. Yes. Was there a pipe? There is still a pipe. It has only forgotten its manners. Demi-Sem set down her lantern, though the daylight now sufficed. "Take the flat stick from my satchel." They worked there for nearly half an hour. Leora knelt in the wet thyme and scraped leaves, grit, and old root fibres from the blocked opening of the clay pipe, while Damisem pried gently at the lipstone and loosened a wad of packed silt with her narrow shovel. At last, with a soft sucking sound, the blockage gave way. Water vanished from the stair, then reappeared beneath it in a bright spill lower down. "There," said Damisem. "A path that keeps dry feet walks longer in memory." Leora wiped mud from her fingers onto the grass and grinned despite herself. They climbed farther. As the sun slowly reached the upper ridges, the valley below lightened in layers. Smoke lifted from the village chimneys. The roofs became clear. Tiny figures moved in the orchard lanes. Goat bells drifted faintly from a meadow above them, each note rounded by the morning air. Kreta. At the top of the dawn stair, the slope broadened into an upper shelf of land that Leora had seen often from below but never visited. It held 3 hay meadows, a ruined summer fold, 2 abandoned orchard plots, and beyond them, set against a shoulder of pale rock, a small building of stone and timber with a steep slate roof and a narrow tower no taller than a chestnut tree. The building stood within a low wall. Near it ran a clear channel of water, diverted from the upper stream and carried along the slope in a stone-cut rill. Behind it rose a cluster of old larches, and beyond those the mountains opened farther, blue on blue, into a pass no longer used by regular caravans. "That," said Damisem, "is the house of ours." Leora had expected something grander and somehow less beautiful, and instead it looked like a place made entirely for purpose. The lower walls were thick stone. The upper frame was larch wood silvered by weather. Under the roof were carved brackets shaped like leaves and little bells. A copper disc, greened and dim, was mounted high on the tower's eastern face. Beside the building stood a post with 3 old bell rings, though only one small bronze bell still hung there. "What does it do?" Leora whispered, although there was no need for whispering. "It listens to light and water," said Demiasem. That answer ought to have been cryptic, yet when the old woman opened the door and Leora stepped inside, she began to see what was meant. The main room was cool and smelled of cedar, damp slate, lamp oil, and something mineral and clean. Along one wall ran shelves holding ledgers, clay marker discs, that rolled waxed cords, small bells, and shallow bowls. In the centre stood a stone basin fed by the narrow channel outside. Above it hung a simple mechanism of copper cups and floats, all tarnished but elegant. On the far side of the room, a slit window faced east. Beneath that window was a polished stone slab marked with carved lines and bronze pins, and beside it an arm with a shadow blade. In another alcove stood a larger water jar with a steady drip falling into a marked vessel. Leora moved slowly, reverently, as if she had entered a place where practical things had been arranged with the care usually given to sacred ones. "This is how the valley used to keep its day," Dame Sem said, setting down her satchel, "before the square clock. Before people grew fond of being hurried by things, they did not wind themselves." She laid a hand on the basin. First light touches the eastern disk above the tower. The reflected beam enters the slit and strikes the line on this stone. That tells the upper terraces when to open the first water gates. The drip measure marks the shared irrigation hours between the shelf meadows and the lower orchards. The bell once signalled noon to the wool washers in the stream and the mule trains on the south path. The ledgers kept track of turns, seasons, repairs, and shadow changes between solstice and snow. Leora stared. The whole valley? Nearly all of it. Not because time lived here, but because people once came here to remember how to divide their work gently. She turned then, and the old humour came back into her face. "You may admire the basin later. Fetch the brush by the door, it is caked with dust." So Leora spent her first morning at the House of Hours not in wonder but in work, which in time she would understand was the proper order of things. She brushed the stone floor, wiped shelves with a damp cloth, carried old leaves from the threshold, and polished the brass lip of the drip vessel, while Damisum trimmed the wick in a wall lantern, checked the eastern slit for spiders' nests, and rubbed a little oil into the pivot of the shadow arm. Outside they cleared grasses from the water channel stones and set right a board leaning over the side rill. Demis moved steadily from task to task, neither rushed nor aimless. Everything had sequence. Only when the sun had climbed higher and the valley below shimmered in full light did they sit on the low wall and eat bread and cheese. "Why do you still keep it?" Leora asked. Damisum took a sip from her own flask before answering. "Because the valley's still a valley, even if some have forgotten its pace. But people use the square clock. Some do. It's easier." "Is it?" Leora thought of the clock in the square. It lost a few minutes every damp day, and gained them again when the air dried. Children trusted it when late to lessons because it could be argued with more easily than the sun. Sometimes Dame Sem looked down the terraces where the stone water channels shone like fine threads. The House of Hours was never only about counting, it was about proportion. If the upper shelf took water too long, the lower orchards went thirsty by afternoon. If the lower lanes delayed the noon bell, the shepherd boys came late with the wool. If the mule drivers climbed too early, the east path was still in shade and slick. Time here was not a line to race upon, it was a pattern of sharing. The old woman rested her hands on her staff. Patterns are easily forgotten if no one tends them. Leora sat very still with that thought. She returned the next morning, and the next after that. Not every day, because houses have needs, and bees wait for no philosophy. She still helped her father skim wax, still turned apricots on the drying trays, still ran errands for her grandmother with the correct herbs, and not the almost correct herbs. But when she could go, she went. Little by little the dawn stare and the House of Hours entered her life like a song learned not by study, but by hearing it daily at the right hour. She learned the stare's moods. After rain it smelled of stone, walnut bark and wet mint. In heat it carried the sweet dusty scent of thyme crushed under boots. In the cool early autumn it filled with fallen birch leaves that made the terns whisper beneath her steps. She learned which stones loosened first after frost, where the side wall held longest shade, where the fig roots crept under the lower bends, and where a rill needed clearing twice in a week if the upper meadow had been cut. She learned the House of Hours too. The basin cups had to be cleaned carefully because mountain silt wore them faster than one guessed. The copper disc on the tower needed wiping with wool and vinegar to catch light properly on misty mornings. The drip measure changed slightly with seasonal pressure in the upper channel, so the old carved marks had to be read with judgment, not superstition. The ledgers contained neat records in several hands, some strong and dark, some faded and gentle, of water turns, terrace repairs, frost dates, bell timings, and the names of families who once climbed weekly to receive or confirm their shares. Many mornings after the first tasks, Dame Esom would ask, "What do you see?" and Leora would look more carefully than before. At first she answered in simple terms, a cracked flagstone, a dry cistern lip, a hinge too stiff. But gradually her answers changed. A channel holding back on the left, copper not taking light cleanly, a shadow line arriving late because the shutter on the birchfold had shifted, lichen thickening on the bell bracket where damp lingered too long, and each time Dame Esom would nod, not lavishly, but as one acknowledges that a young person's sight is becoming trustworthy. Late in the season of apricots, while Leora was sorting old clay marker discs in the ledger room, she found a wrapped bundle on the highest shelf. It was tied with faded blue cord and smelled faintly of cedar and dust. When she brought it down and asked, Dame Esom took it very gently. "My brother's," she said. Leora had heard of him by then. His name had been Terran Vale. He had once walked the upper channels, recorded the water turns, and rung the noon bell across the valley. He had died many years before, not dramatically, some, but in the quiet winter fever that takes some people by degrees and leaves their tools neatly hanging where they last set them. Dame Esom had said little else of him. She untied the blue cord. Inside lay a folded cloth, a brass key, 2 narrow reed pens, and a small wooden tablet marked with timelines in his hand. "He made new ledgers every spring," Dame Esom said, turning the tablet in the light. "He said a valley that writes down its seasons learns itself better. Do you use these still?" The key, yes. The pens, no. I keep them because he held them. There was no tremble in her voice, only the levelness of someone who had lived a long while beside memory and was no longer startled by it. He meant for the house of hours to pass to younger hands, but the square clock came. The orchard owners began setting water by convenience instead of turn. The mule road on the west side grew broader and stole some of the upper traffic. One forgetting invited another. Until only you came. Yes. Why didn't you stop? Dame Esom folded the cloth again. At first because I could not bear to let the basin crack and the copper go dull all at once. Later because the upper meadows still needed their gates timed in dry summers, whether people admitted it or not. Later still because habit and love had become too closely braided to separate. She gave Leora a small look. There are worse reasons to continue. The valley's need for the old ways became clearer that autumn, though not by calamity. No storm broke the channels, no loud quarrels rose over water. Instead there were several small inconveniences, which are often the truest heralds of a forgotten usefulness. A lower orchard lost 2 mornings of shared water because the square clock stopped in damp fog and the family opened their gate late. A shepherd from the upper shelf came down complaining that the noon bell had not been heard for years and the wool washers below no longer knew when to expect the fleeces. The widow nearer, who dried mountain mint and sage on the east terraces, said the dawn stair had become too overgrown for her baskets, so she took the longer orchard road and arrived at market after the cheese women had already claimed the best table shade. Leora's father, carrying honey jars uphill to trade for a sack of coarse wool, muttered that the old rise would have saved him half an hour if its middle bend had not washed soft. Dame Esom only nodded when Leora brought these reports. Usefulness sends whispers before it knocks. What do? We notice which doors the whispers come through. So they began keeping their own list, first in Leora's head, then in a small wax tablet, then in a proper ledger page. Lower orchard timing. Herb baskets delayed. Wool washing uncertain. Honey trade hindered. Upper gate sticking. Shepherds taking the longer west path because the dawn stare did not welcome loaded feet. None of these things would have stirred a council on their own. Together they suggested that the valley's slow old measure had not become useless, only unattended. The restoration, when it began quietly. First came the stair. Dame Isom said that a path must be trusted underfoot before anyone will trust what lies at its end, so they cleared. They cut back wild thyme only where it choked the steps and left it where it perfumed the edges. They scraped moss from the treads and reset 2 side stones at the lower bend. They opened 3 clogged side runnels and patched 1 broken clay pipe with a collar of woven rush and lime paste until a new sleeve could be made. Leora carried baskets of leaf mould away and returned with gravel for the soft spots. Her father came one afternoon with a mallet and set an old railing post straight near the steepest turn. Nera, the herb widow, hearing what they were doing, sent up a bundle of stout hemp cord for the rail, and later came herself with pruning shears sharp enough to shame younger tools. "What made you think of this now?" she asked Leora, cutting bramble from the upper wall. Leora thought for a moment. "The stair still wanted to be walked," Nera laughed softly. "Well, that is better sense than some council show." Then came the water channel beside the house of ours. Melt silt had raised 1 section just enough to slow the basin feed, and the stone lip before the copper disc had cracked from repeated winter freezing. Leora learned to kneel on folded cloth while scraping the channel seams, because cold stone steals patience through the knees, if one lets it. Dame Isom showed her how to set lime mortar not too wet and not too proud of the edge, and how to press wool fibres into the mix where a fine crack needed strength without stiffness. A few days later, Leora's father carried up a small cedar box of beeswax and resin to seal the basin cup pivots. He walked the now cleared sections of the dawn stair, paused, and looked down the valley with that inward expression people wear when an old shape reappears before them. "I'd forgotten this turn," he said at the walnut bench stone. "You could see the whole east orchard from here in frost season. You remember climbing it? As a boy, we used to bring comb for the upper herb woman, your mother too once." He didn't speak of her often while working, and his saying this against the sunlit stone touched Leora more than if he had said much more. "I had not thought of that in years." He helped seal the pivots and stayed to eat a heel of bread on the wall. When he went down, he took the lower steps more slowly than he had come. Word travelled in the valley not by proclamation but by hands noticing other hands at labour. Soon the cooper's sister sent up 2 old iron hooks from her loft, because she remembered the bell frame needing spares. The carpenter twins, both men now but still called the twins because villages keep childhood names far too long, came to inspect the tower shutter and declared that the east hinge had shifted. They rehung it the next day in exchange for a jar of honey and the right to sit in the shade, while Dame Isom told them whether their grandfather had truly once missed the noon bell and watered the wrong terrace on a saint's day. She had told them yes, and with precise detail, which delighted them more than denial would have. Little by little the house of ours began to breathe, as if windows long shut had been opened. The copper disc brightened. The basin cups answered their feed more cleanly. The bell bracket held firm. The dawn stair dried faster after rain. The walnut bench stone, once half buried, stood free again beside the path. Leora found that she had begun to think in the language of maintenance, a joint that should be checked before freeze, a lipstone that wanted resetting after the first snow melt, a bell line that would last another season if kept waxed. This pleased her more than she could easily explain. One morning, when the air had gone very clear and the first yellow leaves from the birches spun slowly onto the stair, Dame Isem led her around the back of the house of ours to a narrow terrace hidden from the village below. There stood a small open shelter of posts and slate, and beneath it a large round stone table carved with radial lines. Above the table hung a bronze plate with a tiny central hole. At certain hours, Dame Isem explained, a pin of sunlight fell through that hole and moved along the lines, showing the seasonal shift of noon more delicately than the larger shadow arm in the main room. "This is beautiful," Leora said. "It is accurate," said Dame Isem, which in her mouth seemed the greater praise. On the edge of the stone table were carved names, dates, watermarks, and little notches for solstice observations. Near one corner, half obscured by lichen, Leora found the faintly cut initials TV. "My brother," said Dame Isem quietly. She touched the carving with one fingertip and then turned away to examine the shelter roof. Leora, sensing the shape of a silence that deserved respect, said nothing. Yet from that morning on she felt more strongly that their work was not only for channels and bells and orchard turns. It was also for memory made useful again, some which is one of the gentlest kinds of honouring. When autumn deepened, the valley's need became clearer still. The first cold mornings made the square clock in the village grow sluggish. The old mechanism had never liked damp air, and now the bell in the square rang wrong often enough that even those who had once defended it began to glance upward toward the eastern shelf. Dame Isem did not mock the clock. She merely wound the house basin, polished the slit, and said, "Metal in a tower can forget its business as easily as people can." 1 week later, with frost silvering the meadow edges and smoke lying low in the lanes, Nera the herb widow asked whether the house of ours might signal first light for the drying terraces again. "Only a bell tap," she said. "Nothing grand. My mint freezes if we wait too long to uncover the racks." Then the wool washers asked if the noon bell could be struck on wash days so the upper flocks would know when to send the second loads. Then a potter from the north shelf wondered whether the old rise might be cleared wide enough for his nephew to bring up clay moulds by handcart instead of taking the long western loop. Then Leora's father, as if ashamed to sound eager, asked whether honey baskets could be sent by the dawn stair during the late chestnut bloom if the rail were extended one more bend. Dame Isem listened to all this in her level way and said, "A thing does not become living again because people praise it. It becomes living again because they ask what it needs." The asking led to more work. The valley did not gather at once with spades and great enthusiasm, but as tales sometimes pretend, real restoration seldom begins in such shining fashion. Instead, it spread through the season, as each household contributed, where its own use and memory touched the old root. The Carpenter twins replaced 2 rotten sideboards on the small bridge that crossed the upper rill beyond the walnut turn. Nera and Leora cut back overhanging elder from the mid-stair so laden baskets would not snag. Leora's father and 2 shepherd boys carried up a bell hammer from the store loft where it had hung forgotten among yokes and sled runners. The cooper's sister fitted a new hoop brace around the large drip jar in the house, because the old one had rusted thin. A mason from the lower lane, who had used the upper channels as a child, reset the lip of the basin feed and refused payment beyond a slice of apricot tart. Or even Tovin found a role, though no one had planned one for him. Sent once to deliver bread and turn back at the walnut bench, he spent the return walk picking loose white stones from the path edge and stacking them carefully on the wall because, he explained, steps liked company. The explanation made no sense and therefore was perhaps truer than most sensible ones. After that, Dame Isem began saving him small, dignified tasks when he came. Carrying pegs, brushing dust from the outer ledge, turning the hour discs so their painted marks would not fade unevenly in the window. One cold, bright morning, while checking the rear terrace shelter, Leora and Damisem found a hidden compartment in the base of the stone table. It held a cedar box wrapped in wax cloth, and within the cloth lay an old valley map painted on linen. The Dawn Stair, the upper meadows, the orchard turns, the western mule road, the wool-washing stream, the spring cisterns, and every shared gate were marked in red, blue, ochre, and black ink. Along one margin ran notes on seasonal timing. First light at midsummer, Beldy lay in heavy snow, water turn length during chestnut bloom, noon line drift in autumn haze. Terran's map, Dame Easam said at once. She sat on the shelter bench with the linen spread across her knees. For a long moment she did not move at all. The mountain air carried the smell of frost and resin from the larches. Below them the valley glowed honey-coloured in the late sun. "Did you think it lost?" Leora asked softly. "Yes." "Will you use it?" Damisem traced one finger over the red line of the Dawn Stair. "I think it has been waiting to be used." From then on the map became part of their work. They compared its marks to the channels still in use and the ones half forgotten. They found a branch rill above the north shelf hidden under sedge, and repaired just enough to feed 2 neglected herb beds. They rediscovered a side landing where mule packs had once been set down before the last ascent. They identified an old resting alcove built into the stair wall at the 7th turn and cleared it, revealing a stone seat smoothed by many backs. Such discoveries did not make the valley gasp or gather in awe. They simply gave practical delight to those who understood that an old route returning is like a cupboard being found at the back of a dark kitchen, full not of treasure exactly, but of the very bowls and measures one has lately been missing. As winter approached, the House of Hours gave its first regular signals in years. Not grand peals. Dame Eason would not allow that wordless sort of sentiment. Instead, the bell above the low post was rung 3 soft notes at first light on frost mornings for the drying terraces, 1 measured noon strike on wool washing days, and 2 evening taps during the final honey pressing so the upper shelf workers would know when shadows reached the cold side of the slope. The sounds drifted across the valley like remembered instructions. People stopped and listened. Then, almost without speaking of it, they resumed certain timings that had once been common. Nera uncovered her herb racks on the first notes. The wool boys descended with better coordination. The honey baskets reached the east trade table before the shade. Then one household opened the upper gate precisely enough that the lower orchards received their due water before noon. Another household, hearing the midday bell, remembered the old rested hour and ceased trying to squeeze one more hurried task between sun and supper. Leora noticed that the valley itself seemed calmer, though she knew this was partly because she had learned to see its rhythm differently. Tasks were not fewer. Bees still swarmed if neglected, apricots still bruised if mishandled, clay still dried too fast if left in wind. Yet when the bells and turns aligned, work did not pile up into fretfulness, it flowed. One evening, while the first snow clouded the high pass but had not yet descended to the shelf, Leora asked Dame Easam, "Did time ever truly move more slowly here?" Dame Easam smiled. There was a rare small smile that made her face unexpectedly bright. "No, but people here once yielded to what could not be rushed. That makes an hour feel wider." The winter snows came gently that year. The Dawn Stair, being on the east slope, cleared earlier than the western road after each fall, but ice took its own toll. Leora continued climbing when weather allowed. She learned to scatter ash on the shaded turns, to check the tower shutter after every freeze, and to warm the basin cups with cloth before asking them to move on the coldest mornings. Dharmaisem taught her how to listen for hidden water under snow, how to tell harmless surface crackle from the deeper, brittle hush that warns against stepping, and how to store the hour discs in wool when the air sharpened enough to split paint. Winter also brought more time indoors, and indoors brought ledgers. By the lamp in the main room, with snow quiet beyond the walls, Dame Sem taught Leora to read the old records properly. Not merely the neat numbers, but the habits behind them. Why a shorter water share in high blossom did not mean meanness, but protection against root rot. Why the noon bell was delayed by 2 breaths on certain midwinter days, because the eastern slit took longer to fill with clean light. Why one family's notes always added mention of chestnut husks, because their drying floor lay at the turn where wind carried them into the basin path if not swept. The old records were not stiff accounts. They were the valley thinking about itself over many years. Leora loved these hours almost as much as the climbing. She loved the thick paper, the dark brown ink, the narrow entries, the drawings of channels and gate pegs in the margins. She loved how practical wisdom could sit beside tiny human notes. Elder branch fell across turn 6, bell rope dried and rewaxed, snow late this year, Merrill's mule stubborn in shade, apricot bloom astonishingly early. She began keeping a newer ledger in her own hand under Dame Sem's eye, first copying, then adding current observations. "You write as if the line might run away," Dame Sem remarked once. Leora loosened her grip on the pen. "I'm trying not to blot. Sense first, neatness second." That too settled into her. By late winter, the House of Hours and the Dawn Stair were no longer merely Dharmaism's concern. The valley had not announced this. It simply behaved that way. People began saying, "Ask at the house," when uncertain of the spring water turns. The square clock was still there, and still useful for some matters, but no one spoke as if it alone defined the day. Leora's father checked frostlight against the first bell before moving the hives. The potter's nephew used the stair to carry narrow moulds to the upper clay shelf. Neera timed her herb turning by the slit light. Shepherd boys once again paused on the 7th turn seat with wool sacks, and did not consider themselves adventurous for doing so. Then came the spring thaw, and with it the real test. Snowmelt in the valley was a slow event, but an insistent one. Water returned everywhere at once, through the main stream and the side rills, down hidden seams of slope, under terrace walls, along forgotten channels behind roots, and over stones that had slept half the year. A valley keeps its shape in winter, in thaw, and it reveals whether that shape has been tended. The Dawn Stair held better than anyone had hoped because its runnels were open. The rill bridge needed only one new brace. The house basin overflowed once and was adjusted. But the old North Branch channel, which the map had helped them uncover, threatened to spill at the second bend and wash an herb shelf below. "Now," said Dame Sem, tying up her cloak, "we see whether our remembering is practical." Leora, though chilled by the meltwater wind, felt a fierce gladness. This was not disaster. It was usefulness asking to be proved. Word spread quickly, but calmly. Neera brought sand sacks. The Carpenter twins arrived with stakes. Leora's father came with waxed cloth and a narrow shovel. 2 older shepherd boys fetched stones from the slope. Risti, Dame Isem, directed with the economy of one who knows the ground and needs no display. The spill was banked, the bend reinforced, and the overflow redirected into an unused side trough that fed a stand of willow below. By afternoon the herb shelf held. By evening the channel ran clear. No one made speeches. Instead, Neera sent up a loaf the next morning, still warm from the oven. The Carpenter twins repaired the bench at the 7th turn without being asked. and the shepherd boys whittled a new measuring peg for the North Branch gate and left it leaning neatly by the house door. That is how gratitude looks in certain valleys. After the thaw came the first full spring of renewed use. Blossom opened across the terraces, pear, then plum, then apricot. The house of ours reflected first light cleanly enough that the slit line returned to its old mark, and the first morning this happened, Dame Isem let Leora ring the bell herself. The sound drifted over the village, soft and exact. Down below, tiny figures moved in response. Gatekeepers, herb women, boys leading wool, and Leora's father turning the hive fronts eastward. She stood with the bell cord in her hands and felt not proud exactly, but placed. Through spring and early summer, the restored route brought back more than timing. It brought back a kind of nearness between the terraces that the longer west road had quietly thinned. Honey travelled upward for herb trade before the sun grew harsh. Wool came down in better order. Clay moulds, rush baskets, apricot trays, beeswax, mountain mint, walnut oil, dried morels, the bundles of dyer's broom, goat cheese wrapped in leaves, and even little packets of saffron crocus bulbs began to use the dawn stair and the upper shelf landing again. Not all goods, not every day, but enough that the path wore a fresh sheen from regular feet. Leora loved to hear what each person carried and why. The shepherd boys brought wool with burrs still clinging. Nera sent mint, sage, and hyssop tied in blue thread. The potter's nephew carried shallow moulds cushioned with sheep fleece. Leora's father took jars of chestnut honey and returned with herb bundles that made their whole house smell bright and green when dried above the beams. Sometimes a travelling scribe from the farther pass, hearing that the old rise was passable again, came by to compare frost dates with Darmisim's ledgers. Once a woman from the neighbouring valley brought reed paper in exchange for a copy of the old watermarks. It was during that busy, gentle summer that Leora began to understand something she had not before had words for. She had always imagined usefulness as something immediate. Carrying water, sealing jars, lifting a hive box, fetching salt before supper. But the house of ours taught a slower usefulness. A rung tightened before it failed. A channel cleared before it flooded. A bell rung so that 5 households need not fret separately. A path dried so that one basket arrives in time and another household's day unfolds more smoothly. This kind of usefulness often went unpraised, yet it held many other tasks quietly upright. One afternoon, while they sat in the rear shelter copying seasonal marks from Terran's map into the new ledger, Leora said, "I used to think being quick was the same as being helpful." Damism drew her finger along a solstice line. "And now? Now I think being in right time is more helpful than being first." Damism gave a little sound in the throat that might have been approval. A better thought. The valley's affection for the renewed place expressed itself in practical offerings. A weaver from the lower lane made a new cloth cover for the ledgers. The cooper's sister sent a small cask for storing extra basin water in dry weeks. Nera donated a bunch of lavender to hang in the main room against moths. Leora's grandmother, who had not climbed the dawn stair in years, did so one mild morning carrying a basket with a folded linen cloth, 3 beeswax candles, and a tiny bottle of apple vinegar. "For the copper," she said, setting it down. "And because houses, even working houses, like a little grace." She looked round the cool room with its basin and ledgers, its slit of white light, and the shadow lines darkening across the marked stone. "I came here as a girl once," she said. "I'd forgotten how calm it feels." That meant more to Leora than if the whole village had clapped. As summer turned to late harvest, Damisem began, without announcement, to place more of the daily tasks in Leora's hands. Leora cleaned the slit window on her own, then the basin cups, then checked the dawn mark, then copied the week's water turn notes into the fair ledger. She went ahead down the stair, sometimes to inspect the rills after night rain. She knew where to brace a loose side pebble before it worked a larger stone free. She knew which gate pegs belonged to which terraces by touch as much as by mark. She knew how to listen to the bell ring and hear from its tone whether the air was too damp and the leather hanger needed oil. It was not that Dame Isom withdrew. Rather, she widened the work so that it could hold both of them. There is a difference, and Leora felt it even before she could explain it. Some mornings the old woman climbed behind her instead of ahead. Some afternoons she remained in the ledger room while Leora made the outer inspection. Once, on a misty day when the path needed only light brushing, Dame Sem sat at the walnut bench and waited there while Leora went up to the house and returned with a report. "Well?" she asked as Leora came down. "Basin sound, north branch a little slow, bell leather dry, east shutter good. 2 herbs hanging inside the lintel, not 3, Dame Sem nodded after each part. "And the 7th turn?" "Still holds." "Then the mountain may keep you another day." The phrase pleased Leora so much that she repeated it to no one, fearing it might lose shape if spoken aloud too often. That autumn the first celebration of the renewed valley hours took place, though no one called it a celebration. It was simply decided after the chestnut bloom and before the walnut pressing that the upper shelf workers and lower orchard keepers would share a noon meal beside the house of hours on the day the shadow line crossed the harvest notch. There were baskets of barley bread, soft goat cheese, dried apricots, walnut paste, honeycomb wrapped in vine leaves, mint tea, and jars of pickled mushrooms from the north slope. People climbed by the dawn stair in 2s and 3s, setting their loads on the restored landing, greeting one another in voices pitched naturally low by the place. Leora helped set bowls on the wall and hung a cloth under the eaves for shade. Tovin arrived with their grandmother carrying a basket of plums and behaved for nearly a quarter of an hour, which was considered notable. The Carpenter twins argued amiably over who had repaired the better hinge. Nera distributed herb sachets to anyone who complained of damp lungs. The shepherd boys, not quite boys anymore, sat on the 7th turn bench like men with market concerns. And Dame Isom, who disliked fuss, allowed herself to sit in the doorway and accept a slice of honey cake without pretending indifference. When the shadow reached the harvest notch, Leora rang the bell once. For then conversation softened, not from solemnity but from shared awareness. For a little while everyone stood in the same noon. After the meal, while people packed their cloths and shouldered their baskets, Leora asked Dame Isom quietly, "Is this why you kept it?" Dame Isom looked over the shelf, the walls, the people, the stone basin with its clean water catching light, the path clear below. "This is part of why," she said. "A place that helps people remember proportion should not be abandoned merely because a metal clock claims to be modern." Then, after a moment, she added, "Also, my brother would have disliked the dust." Winter came again in its measured fashion. By then the house of ours was so fully re-entered into valley life that even the children from the lower lane knew to say, "Listen for the shelf bell," on frost mornings. Leora's family adjusted too. Her father planned honey trades round the dawn signal. Her grandmother sent wool notes to the upper dyer by the stair runners. Tovin drew pictures of the basin and insisted the copper cups looked like little moon boats. One snowy afternoon, while copying weather marks by the lamp, Leora asked Dame Isom, "Did you ever mind that others forgot for so long?" The old woman considered. Snow drifted against the shutter. The basin gave its soft, patient drip. Mind? Yes. Resent? Not much. Valleys forget the way wool tangles, gradually by inattention, not malice. Better to tease the knot apart than curse the fleece. Leora smiled at that and bent again over her page. The deepest lesson of the house did not arrive all at once. It gathered through the seasons the way light gathered over the eastern ridge. Leora had always felt a private urge to hurry, to finish the water carrying first, to climb fastest, to arrive at the market table before the shade shifted, to prove somehow that she could take up space in the day without slowing anyone. After her mother's death, and then with Tovin so young, she had come to believe that being useful meant stepping quickly into every gap before grief or need made itself visible. There was kindness in that instinct, but there was also strain. The House of Hours taught her another way. A basin that filled too quickly spilled its measure. A bell struck before the shadow aligned misled the terraces. A path cleared in haste but not in sequence washed out at the first rain. A valley timed only by speed became fretful, and a fretful valley forgot how much could be shared. Slowly, then unmistakably, Leora began to understand that one can hold a place in a family, a path, a season, or a task without rushing to justify one's presence. One can belong by attending. This settled into her home life as surely as it settled into the house. She no longer darted to answer every call from the hive yard before hearing what was needed. She finished tying one bundle before reaching for the next. She listened to her grandmother's instructions all the way through, and found that fewer herbs were mistaken. She sat sometimes with Tovin when he wanted to show her a beetle shell or a curved twig that looked like a shepherd's crook, and discovered that the house did not collapse for lack of her haste. Her father noticed it too. "You move differently," he said one evening while dipping candle wicks. Slower, more exactly. That pleased her. Then by the third spring after she first climbed with Dame Zem, the Dawn Stair and House of Hours had resumed a place no one would have thought to call new, though for many it was new enough to feel like a blessing. The stair was swept and stable. The seventh turn seat was in regular use. The upper landing received baskets again. The basin marked the shared irrigation hours in dry weeks, and people abided by them more often than not, because they could see how fair measure eased everyone. The bells, though modest, were trusted. The old map had been copied and stored. The ledgers had space for new entries. Even the square clock in the village, still mounted in its place, seemed less burdened by expectation, now that the valley remembered it had more than one way to keep itself in order. That was the season Dame Sem first gave Leora the eastern key. It was a brass key worn smooth at the bow, once Terran's. It opened the rear shelter where the seasonal table stood and the solstice marks were kept. Dame Sem set it in Leora's palm one dawn after they had cleaned the copper disc and checked the first light. "You know the table," she said. "Yes." "You know when not to open the shelter in rain from the pass." "Yes." "You know the difference between a shadow delayed by mist and one altered by a shifted shutter." "Yes." "Then you may keep this one." Leora closed her fingers around the key and felt the small weight of it as something greater than metal. "Only for now?" Dame Sem's eyes held their dry brightness. "Nothing worth keeping is kept forever. It is kept properly for a while." Leora wore the key on a cord under her apron for 3 days before telling anyone except her father, who only nodded and said, "Then the valley has made up its mind about you." On clear evenings that summer, when the upper shelf glowed gold and the valley lanes below had already gone blue with shade, people could sometimes see 2 figures on the dawn stair. One was smaller and lighter in step, carrying a pail or ledger satchel or coil of cord. The other moved with the measured certainty of long acquaintance, staff touching stone now and then at the turns. At first, Damie Sem had led. Later they often climbed side by side. Later still, sometimes, Leora went ahead to the house and prepared the basin, while Damie Sem paused below to speak with a terrace keeper or check a side wall. The sight of them came to mean something to the valley, though no one said it in many words. It meant the stair was open. It meant the basin was watched. It meant the first light would not go to waste on unattended copper. It meant that upper and lower terraces, herb beds and orchards, wool washers and honey traders, all still belonged to a pattern larger than their separate hurry. One late summer evening, after the day's work was done, Damie Sem took Leora to the rear stone table for the setting of the sun. They did not often go there at evening, since the house was most itself in the morning, but that day the air was astonishingly clear. The western ridge held the light so long that each terrace edge below shone for a different length of time, turning the whole valley into a descending sequence of gold, amber, green, and shadow. Even as they sat on the low bench in the shelter, the table's carved lines held the last warmth of day. When I was your age, Damie Sem said, I believed keeping the house meant preserving it exactly as it had been. Every mark, every custom, every timing. Leora turned to listen. My brother taught me otherwise. He said, keep the measure, not the stiffness. Valleys change, frost shifts, paths widen or narrow. People trade honey one generation and wool the next. If the house refuses all change, it ceases to serve the valley and serves only its own vanity. She rested one palm on the stone. Remember that. Leora looked out over the terraces where smoke began to rise from the first evening fires. Keep the measure, not the stiffness, she repeated. Yes. They sat in silence for a while after that. A hawk circled below them, then vanished into the darkening slope. Goat bells rang faintly above the meadows. The valley gathered its evening around itself slowly, lovingly, with the same unhurried care it gave to morning. At last Leora said, I think that is what time was doing all along. What do you mean? Not moving slowly, just refusing to be stiff. Damie Sem's smile then was small but full, a better answer than many scholars would offer. Years would pass as years do, though in the valley they never seemed to pass in a straight line. Apricot seasons returned and deepened. Tovin grew taller and stopped marvelling at spoons, but began marvelling at pulleys and gate locks instead. Honey runs varied. Wool prices shifted. One winter the square clock was finally repaired and kept good time for almost a full year, all which the villagers appreciated without surrendering their renewed habits to it. The House of Hours remained, not as a relic polished for sentiment, but as a working place with basins, ledgers, weather marks, and bells. For now, though, Leora was still 12, becoming 13, and the peace of her days lay in the ongoingness of small, exact tasks. She climbed the dawn stair before first light. She checked the rills. She polished copper when mist dulled it. She wrote new entries in a hand that no longer ran away from itself. She listened when Damie Sem spoke, and also when the house spoke in quieter ways, through drip, light, hinge, stone, and weather. At home, the lesson stayed with her. Her father began trusting her with the honey tallies. Her grandmother asked her to pace the herb drying by the shelf bell rather than by guesswork. Even Tovin would ask on certain mornings, what does the valley say today, meaning the light, the air, the bells, the channel sound? She would answer, not as if translating magic, but as if naming something every place tells those who learn its measure. And when she lay in bed at night beneath the sloped roof, listening to the last bells from the upper meadows and the slow quiet of the house settling around her, she no longer felt the sharp inward push to be faster than her own days. She felt instead that she was held within them. The valley had taught her what the house had long been built to teach, that slowness is not idleness when it is full of attention, and that a life kept in right measure may accomplish as much as a hurried one, while leaving behind more peace. Sometimes, just before sleep, she would think of the first dawn she'd stood in the lane and seen the lantern moving upward toward the old stair. It seemed impossible now that the house had ever nearly fallen out of use, yet she knew that many worthy things do not vanish by a single loss. They fade by degrees, through small neglects, until someone notices the pattern loosening and decides to take up the thread again. That, perhaps, was the deepest comfort of all, for there would always be more to tend, rills to clear, hinges to oil, ledgers to keep, shadow marks to compare in new weather. The valley would never become a finished thing, and neither would she. But she no longer mistook that for failure. She understood that the work of keeping pace with a place is not completed once and for all. It is renewed. So the valley where time moved slowly went on being itself. Morning arrived in layers over the eastern ridge. First light struck the copper disc and slipped through the slit. The bell answered at need. Water found its fair turns through channels old and newly remembered. Honey rose by the dawn stair. Herbs came down. Wool paused at the seventh turn bench. The house of hours stood in its larch shade with basin cool and ledgers dry, and two figures, one old and one young, moved through that rhythm with a steadiness that comforted the whole valley more than either of them ever said aloud. If people below saw the lantern on the stair before dawn, they knew the day had begun in right order. If they heard the noon bell drift over the terraces, they knew shared work was being held in measure. If they lifted their eyes at evening and glimpsed a light still lingering on the upper shelf where Leora and Dame Sia are closing the shutters and checking the basin, they felt the quiet reassurance that comes when useful things are not only remembered, but tended. And in the small stone house above the fig lane, where honey cooled in jars and herbs dried under the beams, Leora slept each night with a calm she had not known before the dawn stair opened to her. She belonged to her family, to her tasks, to her valley, not because she'd been quickest or loudest or most determined to outrun each day, but because she had learned how to enter its measure and keep it with care. Outside, the mountains kept their watch. The terraces breathed out the warmth they had gathered. The last of the goat bells faded from the high meadow. The stream went on, speaking softly over stone, and the valley, patient as a hand turning pages, moved through another night in its old unhurried way, holding within itself the house, the stair, the bell, the light, the ledgers, the water, the memory, and the girl who had learned at last that the truest rhythm of life is not found by rushing toward it, but by listening long enough to hear where it already is. Our second story begins as we follow a colder stream into the western arm of the valley, where cedar houses leaned close to the water and an old bridge listened all day to the river beneath it. This western reach of the valley was unlike the bright terraced slopes where dawn came late and lingered long. Here the mountains drew closer together, the gorge narrowed, the stream, having gathered snowmelt from hidden folds and pine-shadowed runs, moved with a deeper sound and a quicker silver than the rills of the upper shelves. The sun arrived later in some lanes and departed earlier in others, not because the valley loved light less there, but because it gave itself more readily to shade, moss, and the long, cool breathing of stone. The houses of the western reach were built differently too. Many were of dark cedar, and set on low stone foundations against damp, with broad overhanging roofs shingled in split larch, or roofed in thin blue slate that flashed after rain. Their galleries were enclosed more tightly against winter winds. Woodpiles stood under lean-tos. Nets for drying pears and mushrooms hung beneath the eaves. The workshops, tile sheds, charcoal stores, cooper stalls, and the long, low, fulling room by the mill race were clustered close to the stream, because water there was not merely beautiful, it was work. The sounds of that end of the valley were different from the east. Instead of goat bells drifting over hay meadows, there was the rhythmic knock of a fulling mallet, the creak of water wheel spokes turning under weight, the hollow tap of a cooper's hammer on hoop iron, the muted clatter of slate tiles being stacked in a yard, and always, not beneath all else, the river moving through the gorge with a voice at once patient and strong. In damp weather the cedar walls gave off a clean resin scent. In autumn the air smelled of pear leather drying on racks, fresh split wood, wet wool, and kiln smoke. In winter it carried frost, stone, and the dark mineral smell of the stream when ice formed at its edges but never quite claimed its middle. In one of those cedar houses, above an inn stable and beside a yard where barrels were washed and set to dry, there lived a boy of 13 named Tarin. He lived there not with parents in the ordinary way, but with his mother's sister Nima, her husband Paril, their 3 daughters, and an elderly hound called Fen, who had long ago lost interest in barking but had not lost interest in judging people silently from doorways. Tarin's mother, Sella, and travelled most of the year beyond the outer ridge with pack traders who bought felt, wax, dried herbs, and good clay vessels where roads met broader markets. Each winter, when passes closed and the valley turned inward, she came home to stay with them for the cold months. In spring she departed again with the mule strings. No one in the household spoke of this arrangement as unusual, because in valley places families often formed themselves according to work as much as according to custom. Tarin had grown up loved and well fed, taught to carry trays without spilling, to pitch straw cleanly, to sort cups from bowls by touch in the dark pantry, and to mind the river in flood season. Still he had within him a restlessness he did not often name. He watched traders come and go at the inn. He listened to stories of roads beyond the ridge, of markets where bells rang in several tongues, of bright cloth from southern plains and iron nails made in astonishing quantities, and he felt somewhere behind his ribs a reaching he could not settle. His Aunt Nima understood more than he supposed. She had calm hands and a way of hearing what was not yet spoken. Paril, her husband, ran the inn with broad patience, keeping the hearth warm, the tack-hook strong, and the ledger honest. Their daughters, Mila, June, and Oren, were younger than Tarin and considered him both useful and suspect, which is to say they loved him as cousins often do. In winter, when Sella returned, Tarin would sleep easier for the sound of her boots by the hearth and the smell of cold road still clinging to her cloak. In spring, when she left again, as he stood in the inn yard and watched the mule train wind up the road until he could no longer tell which pack bell belonged to her string, then he went back to work. From the inn yard, if one climbed onto the lower wall and looked upstream through the cedar trunks, one could just glimpse the roof of the old bridge. It was known in the Western Reach as the Hushed Bridge, though older people sometimes called it Slate Span, or the Covered Crossing, depending on what they remembered it for. It crossed the gorge not at the broadest part, but at a narrowing where the river pressed between smooth black rocks and became suddenly white and loud. The bridge had sides and a roof, built long ago of heavy beams darkened by time, so that snow would not load its floor too deeply, and spring rain would not swell its joints too fast. On the far side, a stair cut into the slope climbed toward old slate yards, pear terraces, and the shadow road that once threaded through the pines to the north shelf and beyond. In Tarin's childhood the bridge had rarely been used except by shepherds on dry days, children old enough to ignore warnings, and one old man who seemed to belong to it more than anyone living. His name was Osen Ma. He was 79 years old, spare and long-boned, with a face lined by weather and cedar dust, and hands that looked, to Tarin, as if they had been carved from root wood, and then softened by years of careful work. He wore a dark wool coat in all seasons except the hottest afternoons, and around his neck hung a small iron whistle on a cord. He carried a square lantern on dim days and a hooked staff in all weather. People said he had once been bridge warden, a stairkeeper and winter gauge reader for the Western Gorge. Some said he had known every tile mark and load seal on the North Shelf route before the wider cart road was cut along the outer ridge. Some said he could hear from the bridge timbers whether the air held rain or frost. Tarin, who had heard enough old stories to distrust any sentence beginning with "some said," believed at least half of it. Every morning, just after the kitchen fire was coaxed awake, and before the first muleteers came down to break their fast, Tarin would hear the same sounds from beyond the yard wall, the click of the latch on the bridge gate, the measured tap of Osen's staff on the planks, and sometimes the scrape of a shovel if the night had dropped debris on the crossing. On fog mornings, the lantern light would move under the bridge eaves like a quiet ember, and on clear ones, only the rhythm announced him. "Why does he still walk up there?" Tarin once asked Parrell, who was splitting hazel kindling by the wash trough. Parrell did not stop working. "Because the bridge is there." That answer satisfied Tarin no better than such answers ever satisfy the young. Nima, sorting pears for drying, added, "Because the North Shelf Road once mattered to this end of the valley, and Osen has not forgotten that merely because wagons prefer the outer bend. But hardly anyone uses it. Hardly anyone is not the same as no one," she said. That sentence stayed with him. The first time Tarin spoke directly to Osen was by accident, or what looked like accident and later seemed otherwise. Rain had fallen in the night. One of those long, soft rains that darken cedar walls and make the river smell of stone turned over in sleep. Perel sent Tarin to carry a basket of barley cakes to the cooper's widow up the lane. On the way back he took the lower path by the gorge wall, not because it was shorter, but because from there one could hear the underside of the bridge speaking in wet weather. He found Osen standing at the bridge mouth, squinting at a sag in the mossy gutter. "What do you hear?" the old man asked without turning. Tarin nearly dropped the empty basket. "I wasn't making any noise. That is not what I asked." The river boomed softly beneath the planks. Rainwater ticked from the roof. A jay called once in the firs. Tarin listened because he could think of nothing else to do. "The water in the gutter is not running right." Osen nodded as if Tarin had merely confirmed what was obvious. "And why not?" Tarin stepped closer. A spill of cedar needles had gathered in the gutter mouth, and one thin branch had lodged crosswise, holding a dark line of water behind it. "It's blocked." "Yes." The old man turned then. His eyes were pale brown, clear and watchful. "Fetch the narrow hook from my satchel." So Tarin fetched it, and before he knew how it had happened, he was standing on the bridge edge scraping soaked needles from the gutter, while Osen steadied the ladder with one hand and the hooked staff with the other. When the water suddenly freed itself and ran along the wooden trough with a bright hollow sound, Osen said only, "There, a roof should not be asked to keep what belongs in the channel." Tarin, his feeling oddly pleased, stood with wet sleeves and empty hands. "Do you do this every day?" he asked. "Not every day," said Osen, "only the days the bridge receives." That, Tarin thought, was a very old person sentence. But the next morning he found himself listening for the latch click again. 2 days later, he rose early and waited by the yard wall. When Osen passed, lantern unlit in the pearly dawn, Taran stepped out. "I helped with the gutter," he said, by way of introduction. "Yes," said Osen. Taran, who had hoped perhaps for more ceremony, asked bluntly, "Can I come up the bridge road with you?" Osen glanced toward the kitchen chimney of the inn, where the first thread of smoke was rising. "Does your household know you ask?" "Not yet." "Then ask before you offer your feet to old stairs. Also wear better boots." That evening, Taran asked. Nima looked at him over the kneading board, flour on her wrists. Peril glanced up from trimming a tack strap. Mila, June, and Oren all immediately wanted to know whether Taran would fall through rotten boards, find smugglers, or discover a cave full of slate kings. "None of those," said Taran, though privately he felt any of them might enliven a morning. Perel grunted. "With Osen?" "Yes." Nima exchanged a glance with her husband that Torin could not read fully. At last she said, "If Osen invited your hands, he has use for them. That is usually a better reason to go somewhere than curiosity alone. I have curiosity too." "That is acceptable," she said, "but you should lead." Peril set down the strap. "You will do what he says. You will not test the bridge railings because your age inclines you to prove foolish theories. If the north stair is slick, you come back. If weather turns, you come back. If Osen says a beam is soft, you do not argue with it using your old weight." "I won't." "Good," said Parles, "then go." The next morning the gorge held a soft fog and the river sounded nearer than the eye could place it. Taran met Osen at the bridge gate. The old man carried his usual staff and lantern, but also a canvas satchel, a small hatchet, and a coil of waxed cord. The hushed bridge felt longer inside than it looked from outside. Its plank floor dipped slightly toward the middle, worn smooth by countless feet and hooves from years when traffic had been regular. Slots of light showed between the sideboards. The roof beams smelled of cedar, damp, and long-kept smoke from the little lanterns that had once hung inside on winter evenings. Under the bridge, water moved with such force that the whole timber body seemed faintly aware of it, not trembling exactly, but listening. At the midpoint, Osen stopped. "What do you see?" he asked. The question, simple and exact, had a way of making Taran straighten inwardly. He looked along the beam lines, the floor, the roof. Moss at the north edge, one loose shingle outside. Rail smooth here from hands, resin crack in the crossbeam, and... He bent a little. "This plank takes water at the seam." Osen gave a single approving breath through the nose. Better than most grown men. On the far side of the bridge, the old north stair climbed steeply under fir and beech. It was narrower than the dawn stair of the eastern shelf and very different in feeling. Instead of broad turns through open terraces, it wound close to the gorge wall, with shadow on one side and glimpses of rushing water below the other. Ferns grew between its stones. Little retaining walls appeared and vanished. In places cedar roots had shouldered under the steps. In others, old drainage cuts crossed the treads and had half filled with pine needles. They climbed to a shelf where the slope eased. There, to Taran's surprise, stood the remains of a loading yard. 3 stone platforms, a long low shed with half its roof missing, a mule ring post, and beyond them a line of path continuing into dark pines toward the north shelf. "This was a road?" he asked. "It still is," said Osen, "though it has become shy." He pointed with the staff. "Slate once came down from those cuttings beyond the pines. Pear leather and dried apples from the shelf orchards. Felt bootliners from the fullers above the cold meadows. Willow charcoal packed in sacks. Clay cups from the gorge kilns going up. Mushrooms and resin coming down. In thaw season, when the outer road softened, this way held. In early snow it held too, because the bridge roof kept the crossing passable. Why did people stop using it? Because the outer road widened. Because loaded carts prefer broad turns to old stairs. Because people love convenience until weather reminds them they should also love alternatives. Because one shed roof went, then one drain, then one handrail, then another. Roads and bridges are not usually abandoned by decision. We more often by an untidy chain of smaller neglects. He said this as if he had said it before, perhaps many times, perhaps to no one. They worked that morning on the stair drains. Taryn scraped pine needles and silt from the narrow cuts, while Osen pried loose roots where they had entered the seams. Water began to run where it ought. The stair beneath their boots felt more exact once the damp had a place to go. Afterward they climbed to the loading platforms, and Osen cleared the mule ring post base with his hatchet and a short shovel from the shed. "Why bother with the post if no mules come?" Taryn asked. Osen set the shovel aside. "Because a place that looks ready is more likely to be trusted than a place that looks forgotten." The words stayed with Taryn all day. He returned the next morning, and many after that, whenever in work and weather allowed. His household, after some days of practical testing, grew used to it. Nima would press a piece of oat bread or a wrapped slice of pear cheese into his hand at dawn. Peril lent him better boots, and later an old tool belt with one stitched loop broken and repaired. Mila, June, and Oren demanded detailed reports of every outing, and were disappointed by the smallness of the actual findings. A drain cleared, a roof peg replaced, a shed wall propped, a stair edge brushed. Taryn, however, found the smallness of the work oddly satisfying. Small things changed the sound of places. He learned the bridge first, how to hear a dry board and a damp one by their answer underfoot, how to smell roof trouble before seeing it in heavy weather, how to clear the gutter without dislodging shingles already holding by habit more than by fastening, how the wind entered from the gorge mouth in late autumn and required the west latch to be checked twice, how the bridge gates at either end must never be allowed to warp shut entirely, even in disuse, because emergency passage is discovered only in the hour it is needed. He learned the north stair too, where slate chips made the tread slick, where moss could stay because it held the wall, and where it had to be scraped because it was merely beautiful and dangerous, where a hand on the rail helped loaded feet, and where one should not trust the rail until it had been reset. Higher still he learned the old shelf path through the pines, where resin gathered on warm bark, and the ground smelled of needles, stone dust, and distant pear drying in autumn. He also learned Ozen's habits. The old man carried, in addition to rope and tools, a folded oilcloth packet of bridge nails, a brass hinge pin, 2 wedges of cedar, a wick roll, a bit of chalk, and a tiny tin of grease that smelled faintly of pine smoke. He never sat before checking the nearest drain. He never crossed the midpoint of the bridge without laying a hand, however lightly, on the north beam. He spoke little while working, and more easily while tightening cord or resting a moment on a loading platform. Sometimes he would point and ask, "What do you see?" Other times he would say nothing, and Taryn had to learn by watching. One morning, after a night of hard wind, they found 3 shingles torn loose on the upstream side and 1 gutter bracket twisted outward. "We need more hands," Taryn said. "So, eventually," said Osen. "First we need better understanding." So they measured. They counted damaged pegs. They inspected the roof from the inside and found the weakened brace that had allowed the strain. They checked the old shingle stack in the loading shed and discovered that several larch pieces remained sound under the dust. Taryn held the ladder, then climbed it, then passed nails, then learned how to seat a replacement so the roof accepted it, rather than merely endured it. Later, sitting on the loading platform and drinking from a shared flask of fennel tea, Taryn asked, "Were you always the bridge warden?" "No. What were you before?" "Younger." Taryn laughed despite himself. After a while, Osen continued. "My father worked the span in winter and the stair in thaw. My oldest sister kept tallies for the loading yard and marked the pack loads. I carried wedges, fetched tools, and learned to listen before I was useful. Later I kept the bridge through 3 hard snow years and one spring when the outer road slid twice in the same week. After that, most seasons were easier and less well remembered." "You had a sister?" "Yes, Mirelle." His voice remained level, but he looked across the platforms as he said it toward the pine path. "She married a slate cutter from the North Shelf. Died old enough to complain beautifully about pears being dried too thin. A good age." Taryn liked the phrase and stored it away. By early autumn, people had begun to notice the changes without naming them grandly. The bridge gutters ran, the gate swung better, the lower stair no longer held puddles at its shadowed turns. A pear grower from the North Shelf used the path one morning with 2 donkeys lightly loaded in empty panniers, just to see if it held. He came back the same afternoon with pear leather and dried rings, nodded once to Osen and said, "Shorter than I remembered." That single sentence pleased the old man more than public thanks would have done. Then the cooper's widow sent 2 small casks over by the bridge route, as the outer bend had been churned by tile carts, and she feared splintering the hoops in the ruts. Then a fuller's apprentice crossed with felt liners bundled in waxed cloth because mist had delayed the cart road. Then Nima herself, who rarely left the inn during busy weeks, sent Taryn up with a basket of barley bread, onion rolls, and 2 jars of plum preserved to exchange with the shelf orchard woman for dried pears and walnut paste. "You may as well carry trade if you're already carrying your curiosity," she said. The bridge road began in this way to remember. Taryn found his restless feeling changing, though he did not notice it all at once. He still listened eagerly to travellers in the inn. He still wondered about roads beyond the valley, markets beyond the ridge, and towns where bells rang from more than one square. But now, when muleteers spoke of mountain passes or valley crossings, he heard their stories differently. He listened not only for distance, but for the work that made distance passable. Who cleared the ford after rains? Who kept the snow poles upright? Who watched the hanging bridge chains? Who knew when the mule shelf cracked first after frost? The world beyond seemed less like a string of bright scenes, and more like a vast lacework of tended passages. This comforted him in a way he had not expected. One evening, while helping Perel hang wet saddle blankets by the hearth, he said, "Maybe roads aren't only for leaving." Perel, who was not surprised easily, merely shifted one blanket to catch the heat better. "No," he said. "Mostly they are for arriving, provided someone has kept them sound." The real turning in the story of the bridge road came with the first autumn rains. Not a violent storm, for such things belong to louder tales than this one. Rather a week of steady weather, grey and thorough, that softened the outer cart road around the exposed bend below the slate yard. Wheel ruts deepened there. One loaded cart had to be unloaded halfway and brought around in 3 journeys. Another delayed 2 full days waiting for drier ground. Word moved from house to house and yard to yard in the Western Reach that the North Shelf goods would soon pile up if some alternate passage did not ease the trouble. Osen did not say, "I told you so." He only went the next morning to inspect the bridge before dawn. Taryn, who'd grown used to reading the weather in his movements, met him there without being asked. The bridge held well. The roof kept the planks dry enough. The stair, however, showed 2 weak places under the alder roots. Beyond the loading yard, the pine path had slumped at one shoulder, where runoff cut under the edge. It was passable for careful feet, perhaps for light donkeys, but not for steady traffic yet. We need more than the 2 of us, Taryn said. Yes, said Osen. Now people are likely to hear. They went first, not to the council. Western folk trusted benches, sheds and doorways more than formal declarations. But to those whose goods and days were already being inconvenienced, the shelf pair grower agreed at once to send a son with a shovel. The fuller's master offered 3 apprentices if the path could be widened enough for bundled loads. Nima said the inn would provide bread and hot broth for a work morning if others came. The cooper's widow promised spare hoops for reinforcing the loading shed beam if anyone would help lift it. A tile maker on the north shelf said he still had 2 old pack boards meant for the bridge route and would fetch them from his loft. Even the potter from the lower lane, who preferred flatter approaches for obvious reasons, contributed 3 glazed drain pipes when told the lower stair channel needed sleeving, so the work gathering began. On the first morning of it, the gorge smelled of wet cedar, turned earth, and smoke from the broth kettles Nima had already set to warming. People came in 2s and 3s, not with festivity but with readiness. Shovels, pry bars, rope, mallets, pruning hooks, boards, wicker sleds for rubble, baskets of nails, wedges wrapped in cloth, and once, delightfully, a tin of preserved cherries sent by a woman who could not climb but would not be left out. Osen organised the tasks in the same quiet manner with which he had long organised them for himself. Lower stair drains first, because water must have honesty before roads can have traffic. Then the alder root weak spots. Then the shed beam. Then the slumped shoulder on the pine path. Taryn moved through it all with a kind of bright inward steadiness, carrying wedges, holding lines, testing footing where told, relaying Osen's brief instructions to those farther up the path. The restoration did not happen in one day, of course. Real work on old routes rarely does. But something important happened in that first gathering. The bridge road ceased to be Osen's private persistence, and became once more a shared concern. That change is often the true beginning of revival. Over the following weeks they worked in rhythm with weather. Dry mornings were for lifting and setting stone, damp ones were for roof pegs, hinge greasing, and sorting salvage in the loading shed. Windy afternoons were good for brush clearing because cut pine boughs dried quickly off the path. After rain, the men and boys checked the drains. On misty days, when the gorge amplified every drip, women from the shelf carried light loads over the bridge deliberately, testing its regained usefulness with wicker baskets and wrapped bundles. Taryn loved the loading shed most of all. At first it had seemed only a half-collapsed structure with one surviving beam, and a roof that admitted weather in several opinions. But once the cooper's widow's hoops braced the beam, and the shelf tile maker supplied spare slates for patching, its shape re-emerged. Inside they found old tally marks on the posts where pack loads had once been counted. They discovered a bench under stacked boards, a wall niche for lanterns, and a rack of mule pegs wrapped so thickly in dust that Taryn sneezed for a full minute after touching them. His Osen cleaned each peg as if greeting an old acquaintance. "My sister used to keep the load chalk here," he added once, tapping a shelf. "Piers left. Felt centre, slate right, because it's shipped least there." Taryn imagined the shed alive again. Donkeys steaming in cold weather, pear trays stacked, slate ringing softly as is set down, lantern light on damp wool cloaks, tally marks renewed. The image pleased him so deeply it felt almost like homesickness for something he had not known. One noon, while they sat on the platform eating barley rolls and onions from Nima's basket, Tarin asked, "Did you ever want to leave the gorge?" Osen chewed slowly, then answered, "Certainly." "Did you?" "For 2 seasons. I went with timbermen beyond the West Ridge, learned that other valleys also have rain, weak hinges, and men who think a road maintains itself because they are busy elsewhere." Tarin laughed. "I saw wider places," Osen continued. "It did me good. Then I came back because a bridge I knew had begun speaking in a way that suggested it needed listening." Tarin was quiet a moment. "Do you ever regret returning?" "No." Osen looked through the shed opening toward the hushed bridge roof below. "A wide world is not only reached by walking away. Sometimes it arrives by every path you keep sound." The sentence stayed with Tarin for so long that he later repeated it to himself while polishing cups in the inn, and did not fully understand why it made his chest feel easier. As autumn deepened, goods began moving by the bridge road, often enough that routines formed around it. Their pear leather came down in wrapped boards at dawn while the roof boards were still dry. Felt liners crossed by late morning when the bridge interior had taken the chill out of the planks. Cooper hoops, willow charcoal, beeswax candles, and once even a set of hand-carved spoon blanks from the north shelf, wood turner passed over in light but regular amounts. In return went in flour, salt, glazed cups, lamp oil, and packets of herbs, Nima assembled for families higher up the path who had little time to come down during pressing days. The route did not become grand. Carts still preferred the outer road whenever it held, but the bridge road regained a dependable, modest importance, which suited it. Tarin began hearing people say things like, "Well, take slate span if the bend is soft," or "send the felt by the hushed bridge before the mist thickens," and each time the words gave him quiet pleasure. The inn changed too. More shelf folk came through the yard now, even if only to pause and trade. They brought news of frost on the pear rows, of how the tile kilns smoked in damp air, of a northern spring running stronger this year, of mushrooms thick under the beech stand above the bridge road. Tarin listened while carrying trays, and his longing for the far world became more balanced by appreciation for the many worlds already meeting at their door. When the first frosts silvered the gorge, Osen showed Tarin another part of the route he had not yet seen. Beyond the loading shed, through the pines, the path widened briefly and past a small stone shelter built against a rock face. It had a slate roof and a bell niche above the door, though no bell remained. Inside stood a bench, a ring for tethering, and shelves worn smooth by old baskets. "This was the Paw's house," Osen said. "For what?" "For loads waiting on weather, for mule strings breaking the climb, for late walkers unwilling to cross the bridge in full dark, for hot pear trays cooling before descent, for anyone who needed dry boards and a little patience." Tarin ran his fingers over the tethering. "Does anyone use it now?" "Not yet." The yet glowed in the air between them, so they added the Paw's house to their care. They swept it, reset one slate, cleared the niche, and reopened the little side drain where water had crept in under leaf rot. Tarin found an old clay cup in the shelf dust and a hook pin half buried in the threshold. Osen found, he'd tucked in a crack near the back wall, a strip of waxed linen with faded tally lines and the initials M.M. "Morel again," Tarin guessed. Osen nodded. He folded the strip and put it in his pocket without another word. But the silence beside that gesture was warm, not shut. Winter came more sharply to the western reach than to the bright eastern terraces. Shade lasted longer. Ice formed at the gorge edges and on the lower stones of the stair. The hushed bridge roof gathered snow in white shoulders that slid off with soft thumps by noon. Traffic lessened, but the route did not sleep. If anything, it became more valuable because the outer road along the exposed bend froze unevenly, and cart ruts turned treacherous under thin crusts. Taryn's work with Osen changed with the season. They spread ash on the shaded steps. They checked the bridge gates morning and afternoon. They kept the gutters clear of snowmelt. They carried lamplight on fog evenings and hung a small bell by the bridge mouth for those late crossings when sight could not be trusted far. Nima began sending hot broth to the Paw's house in a lidded pot on the coldest market days, and more than one traveller blessed her name over a steaming cup beneath the slate roof. One night, after a soft snowfall, Taryn stood with Osen in the covered bridge, while the river rolled black beneath the plank gaps, and the roof held the hush of snow above them. A lantern hung from the centre beam, turning the cedar walls honey-coloured. Outside, the gorge seemed made of darkness and whiteness in equal measure. "Is this why you stayed?" Taryn asked quietly. "Because it mattered in weather?" Osen laid a hand on the middle beam. "Partly. Also because people overvalue brightness. There is honour in being useful when the world narrows." Taryn listened to the river below and thought that might be true of more than bridges. The winter passed not dramatically but usefully. The bridge road carried what it needed to carry. Pear stores moved, felt and wax traded, messages crossed. Once, on a fog-dense evening, Mara, the birthwise woman from the North Shelf, came over by lantern light to attend a labour in the lower lane, and the bridge bell guided her back through the murk after dawn. She stopped in the inn-yard on her return to thank Nima for the broth and Osen for the lamp, but what she said to Taryn stayed with him longest. "It is a calm thing," she said, "that to know a road has been kept by hands that pay attention." He remembered that in spring. With Thor, the outer road recovered, yet the bridge road was not forgotten again. That was the difference. Because it had been useful through winter, because people had carried, waited, traded, and rested there. It had re-entered the Western Reaches' habits. A North Shelf potter began sending small fineware by the sheltered route, because the covered bridge jostled it less than cart ruts. Perel arranged for 3 sacks of good barley to come by the loading shed because it was easier to divide them there into shoulder loads of the lane. Nima developed a standing exchange of onion rolls and dried herbs with an orchard widow on the far slope, and Taryn carried the baskets proudly over the span. Meanwhile the work continued, because once a route lives again, it always asks to be lived with. They rebuilt part of the rail on the upper stair. They whitewashed 3 marker stones half hidden in ferns near the pine bend. They hung a new bell in the Paw's house niche, a small mellow bronze one from the cooper's loft, and fixed a pull cord inside the doorway so those arriving in mist could announce themselves to anyone sheltering there. They mended the bridge roof ridge with slate pieces sealed in resin. They set a narrow shelf in the loading shed for ledgers and chalk. Taryn, in moments between labour, copied the first new tally notes there in a careful hand. Pear leather, 9 boards. Felt, 6 bundles. Clay cups, 1 crate. Charcoal, 2 sacks. In flour, 1 divided load. Wax, 4 wrapped rounds. Seeing those notes made the shed feel truly awake. By midsummer the route had acquired a rhythm of its own. Light goods at dawn, weather watching before noon, repair in the hot quiet hours, evening crossings when the bridge interior held cool shade, and the gorge smelled of wet stone rising from the river. Taryn had grown taller, steadier, less quick to daydream while carrying actual weight. Osen had not softened exactly, but he had become more visibly at ease with company. Sometimes they spoke while walking, sometimes they did not, and the silence between them felt companionable as plank shadows. One afternoon, while they were replacing the bell rope at the bridge mouth, Taryn said, "I used to think travelling meant moving far away, and now I think maybe it also means learning how many things pass through one place." Osen tied the knot, tested it, and gave a slight nod. "Better." Taryn smiled because Osen's best praise often sounded like correction. Another subtle change had come to the inn. Taryn's mother Sella returned that winter and found him altered in a way she noticed at once. He still wanted stories of the outer roads. He still asked what markets smelled like in rain, and whether southern traders truly dyed wool that bright. But he listened differently. He asked about bridge wardens in the ridge towns, about snow poles, ferry planks, way sheds, roofed crossings. He asked who kept those things and how they knew when to mend them. Sella, who had spent years on roads made passable by hands she never met, looked at him for a long time by the hearth one evening and said, "You have found a route worth listening to." He nodded. "I hoped," she said softly, "that your restlessness would become not smaller, but wiser." He thought of the hushed bridge, the loading shed, the pause house bell, the upper stair after rain. Maybe it has. Spring came again, and with it a small festival not called a festival. It happened because the Shelf Orchard widow had a good pear year. The Fullers had sold their liners well, and the inn had taken enough trade through the bridge road that Prell declared a noon meal should be carried to the loading shed for all who had helped keep the route. So they spread cloths on the platforms and the bridge mouth. There were rye loaves, onion cakes, soft cheese, pickled mushrooms, honey, pear paste, dried apple rings, walnut bread, and a kettle of mint tea. Children ran short errands and were warned not to run on the stair. The cooper's widow claimed the best post against the shade. Nima handed bowls to anyone not quick enough to refuse. The bell in the pause house rang once in the wind and pleased everyone. Osen sat on the platform edge with a bowl in his hands and looked, Taryn thought, as if he were trying not to appear content. This made him appear even more so. "Does it feel strange?" Taryn asked quietly, "having others use it again?" Osen considered. Relief is sometimes a strange feeling if one has carried a thing alone too long. Taryn looked toward the bridge roof below them. "Does it feel lighter?" "Yes," said Osen after a time, "and larger." That evening, after the last bowls had been carried down and the light turned copper on the cedar trunks, Taryn remained a little while on the bridge alone, not because he was lonely, and simply because the place felt full in a way he wanted to hear. The river spoke beneath him. Somewhere up the stair a late donkey snorted. The bridge board smelled of warm cedar and the day's faint traffic. He thought of all that had passed there in recent months. Pears, felt, cups, wax, messages, weather, broth, lanterns, late walkers, careful hands, old memory, new trust. He realized then that his yearning for far roads had not vanished. It had widened. He still wanted someday to cross beyond the outer ridge with his mother, perhaps, or with a trader string of his own, and see where the valley's goods went. But he no longer imagined that leaving would be the only form of largeness available to him. The bridge had taught him something slower and steadier. A place well kept could become a meeting of many distances, while one did not have to outrun home to touch the wider world. Sometimes one built its doorway. When he said something like this to Nima later, haltingly and with more embarrassment than such thoughts deserved, she only smiled into the bread she was slicing. "Of course," she said, "inns know that. Bridges know it too." By the third year of Taryn's work with Osen, the hushed bridge route had become ordinary again in the best possible way. That phrase would have delighted Osen. who disliked grandeur in any context involving planks and drains. The bridge was simply used. The stair was simply maintained. The loading shed held chalk and pegboards. The pause house kept a bench dry. Pear leather and felt and cups and wax crossed when needed. Travellers no longer spoke of the route as if it were a quaint survival or Osen's stubborn path. They spoke of it as one says take the North Crossing, or send it by slate span, or wait out the mist in the shelter. Useful, known, dependable. That was enough. Tarin grew into the work as though his bones had expected it. He learned to judge roof strain by snow line, to whitewash the marker stones so they were visible but not garish, to keep the loading ledger dry, to choose which repairs needed a mason and which only patience. Osen let him take the first morning inspection on clear days and the last evening latch check in dry weather. Sometimes the old man waited at the bridge mouth while Tarin climbed to the loading yard and returned with news. Sometimes Tarin stayed at the shed to receive a delayed load while Osen descended. This was not a great handing over. It was the slow widening of a shared task until it fit 2 lives. One dusk in early autumn, when the gorge air smelled of pears and the bridge roof still held warmth from the day, Osen handed Tarin the iron whistle that had long hung around his own neck. Tarin looked at it in surprise. Why? Because if fog comes and I am above the shed while you are below, the bridge should not have to guess which of us is where. That's practical, Tarin said, though he knew the gift carried more than practicality. Osen's eyes narrowed a little with dry amusement. Most worthwhile gifts are. Tarin took the whistle. The iron felt cool and worn smooth by years of use. He put it on without another word. The autumn that followed was the gentlest one Tarin could remember. Pears dried well. Slate loads moved in measured numbers. The river ran full but not unruly. The outer road held more often than not. Yet the bridge route remained part of the Western Reach's daily thinking, and on calm evenings, when work was finished and the inn-yard settled into lamps, people could sometimes see 2 points of light moving in the gorge. One would be lower on the bridge, steady and youthful now in its confidence, pausing at the midpoint then going on. The other, if Osen still crossed that night, would appear above on the stair or at the loading shed, patient as old cedar and content not to shoulder the entire route alone. The lights would answer one another through the trees as softly as bells. To the households below, they meant the bridge gates had been checked, the stair drains were clear, the shelter stood ready, and the northway remained trustworthy. It was a peaceful sight. It told anyone looking that the crossing held, that the roof had been listened to, that the old planks still knew the shape of careful feet, that the loading shed, once left to dust and weather, had again become a place where goods rested, where lanterns were hung, where chalk marked honest trade. And in the inn above the river yard, where cups dried on the shelf, tack hung by the hearth, and warm bread was always kept back for late returners, Tarin slept each night with a quieter mind than he had once known. He no longer felt that every road worthy of wonder must begin by taking him away. He had learned from the bridge, from Osen, from the gorge's patient sounds, that steadiness is also a way of travelling. To keep a passage open is to let the world move through it. To tend a threshold is to touch all who cross. So the western reach of the valley went on in its cool cedar rhythm. All water-turned wheels, pears dried under eaves. Slate rang softly in stacked piles, felt hung in the fulling room. The river kept speaking to rock and timber. The hushed bridge listened and answered in its own way, through dry planks, running gutters, and well-kept gates. Osen still walked it, though not always first now. Tarin walked it too, and sometimes ahead. If travellers crossing an evening heard the small iron whistle once in the mist, they knew where the younger keeper stood. If they heard the answering tap of an old staff on plank, they knew the elder was near. And between those sounds the bridge held, the stair climbed, the shed received, the shelter waited, and the valley, slow and practical and full of paths that remembered, kept another season in peace. Our third story begins as we follow the warmer air toward the southern bowl of the valley, where whitewashed walls held the day's heat long into evening, and where the earth, even in spring, always seemed to be listening for water. This was the sun-baked end of the valley, though even there the light behaved with gentleness rather than harshness. The mountains opened wider to the south, and the slopes descended in long pale folds of limestone and ochre soil toward vineyards, fig terraces, saffron strips, and almond groves netted against birds. The houses were unlike the cedar homes of the western gorge, and unlike the grey stone dwellings of the eastern shelves. Here they were built around courtyards, with lime-plastered walls that glowed softly at dusk, with flat roofs edged in tile, with low archways leading to cool storage rooms where jars stood in ordered rows. Vines were trained over pergolas for shade. Blue and green glazed bowls hung on sunny walls to catch light. Clay cisterns lay half-buried in courtyards, domed and white, their mouths covered with carved wooden lids. In the hottest months, reed screens were lowered over the south-facing openings, and the air smelled of chalk, warm dust, rosemary, fennel seed, sun-warmed figs, and the mineral sweetness of water kept cool underground. The sounds there belonged to dryness and patience. Doves settled on roof edges and cooed in the evening heat. Cicadas sang among the almond trees until the stars came out. Mortars thudded in courtyards where women pounded saffron and dried herbs. Clay jars rang softly when set down in rows. And goats moving along the terraces made a lighter, quicker music than the big bell sheep of the upper meadows. And late at night, when the warm air loosened at last and cooler currents came slipping down from the stone shoulders of the mountain, one could sometimes hear another sound, a faint tinkling and dripping from the south slope above the village, as if somewhere in the dark pottery cups were being touched by invisible fingertips. In a whitewashed house with a fig tree growing through the courtyard and shading half the roof stairs, there lived an 11-year-old girl named Nerin. She lived there with her mother Ada, who dyed wool and linen using saffron stamens, madder root, walnut husks and indigo cakes brought over the ridge in wrapped cloth. With her stepfather Belan, who plastered cisterns, repaired lime walls, and could tell by one glance whether a roof channel would hold another season. And with her twin half-brothers Sivo and Sen, who were 3 years old, and had already discovered that speaking at once made the world answer more quickly. There was also a widowed great-aunt Tisa, who lived in the back room where the cool stayed longest and spent her days sorting lentils, stringing figs, and remembering the names of families whose houses had long ago become pear stores, dye sheds, or simply ruins under time. Nerin's own father had been a vineyard tender on the northern side of the valley, and had died in a winter illness when she was very small. She remembered almost nothing of his face, but she remembered the texture of his wool sleeve and the smell of grape leaves after rain because her mother, careful in all things, had never tried to smooth grief into a shape that looked simpler than it was. Years later, Belan had come into their lives, first as the man who repaired the plaster crack in the cistern dome, then as the man who stayed to share tea, then as the man who lifted roof jars more carefully than anyone else, and finally as the man whose tools hung by the courtyard wall beside Ada's dye paddles and no longer looked borrowed. Belan was kind, and Nerin knew it, He never took up too much room in the house. He mended the twins' little sandals. He reinforced the pergola when the fig vine grew heavy. He remembered exactly where Ada liked the indigo cloths turned in shade rather than sun. He treated Nerin with patient respect, never forcing an affection that had to grow in its own season. Yet Nerin, who had been old enough to remember before and young enough to feel protective of that before, still carried an inward stiffness she seldom spoke of. It was not anger, not really. More a sense that the house had rearranged itself around newer needs, the twins, the dyed cloth orders, the plaster work, the coming and going of clients, and that she was expected to fit into the rearrangement gracefully because she was sensible. She was sensible. That, sometimes, was the trouble. She carried dye bundles. She watched the twins in the courtyard while Ada turned madder in the vat. She strung fig with teaser in the afternoon heat. She ran errands to the saffron women or the jar merchant and rarely forgot a thing. Yet inside her there was often a restless dryness, as if something in her wanted one clear, the unmistakable place to pour itself, and had not found the basin for it yet. At dusk, when the dye yard was washed and the twins had finally fallen into that drowsy quiet that comes after much stubbornness, Nerin liked to climb to the flat roof and look southward. From there she could see the long, pale slope beyond the last vineyard walls. It was crossed by a narrow contour path, hardly used now, and above it stood the remains of an old place no one in the house spoke of often. In the fading light it looked like a line of broken arches, poles and low walls arranged across the hillside. Sometimes white lengths seemed to flash there as if cloth had caught the last sun. Sometimes, on the hottest evenings when the valley waited thirstily for night, she saw one old man walking that path with a staff in one hand and a bundle of folded linen over the other arm. He went at nearly the same hour every evening. Nerin first mentioned him to Teaser, who was sitting in the courtyard cracking almonds with the back of a spoon and placing the kernels carefully in a bowl. "That is Master Corin," said Teaser, not looking up. "Who is he?" "The last dew keeper," Nerin frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means he kept the dew." "That is not an answer." Teaser smiled into the bowl of almonds. "It is the old answer. The rest requires a longer evening." Bellon, hearing from the cistern mouth where he was checking the interior plaster with a lamp, added, "He tends the dew court above the south terraces. Does anyone still use it?" Bellon lifted himself back out of the cistern and wiped his hands. Less than they should." Ada, who was folding dyed linen on the bench, said, "When I was a girl, the south growers watched his cloths the way the shepherds watch frost lines. If the dew run was good, the seedling beds could rest another day before the cistern turn." Nerin turned that over. "Cloths," Ada nodded. "Go ask him if you truly want to know. He likes questions that have walked a little before they arrive." This sounded like something older people said to make curiosity behave. But the next evening Nerin found herself waiting by the lane where the southern contour path began. The old man came as the shadow from the fig tree reached the last white wall. He was 84 years old, though Nerin did not know the number at first. He moved not with frailty, but with the careful efficiency of a person long acquainted with hills and jars. His hair, tied back with a narrow strip of undyed cloth, was white with a faint yellow cast like old linen. His face was lined, sun-browned, and dry in the way of those who have spent many years in hot air and clear light. He carried a hook-ended staff of almond wood, a bundle of rolled white cloth, and a string of little blue-glazed cups that clicked gently against one another as he walked. At his belt hung a leather pouch, a clay whistle, and a brass key. He stopped when he saw Nerin waiting. "You are in the path of the evening," he said. Nerin had planned a more graceful opening than the one that came out. "I wanted to ask where you go. Up the Dew Walk." "What is the Dew Court?" "A place where the valley once remembered that not all water falls from clouds." Nerin stared at him. The sentence felt like a jar tapped lightly to hear if it rang true. "Can I see it?" "Perhaps." "When?" "When your household agrees, and when you understand that the south slope rewards steady feet more than hurried ones." "I can walk steadily." "Can you?" His tone was not teasing exactly, only exact. Nerin, who knew very well that she had a habit of leaping onto low walls and taking stairs 2 at a time when impatient, did not answer at once. "That," said the old man, "is a better beginning." He shifted the rolled cloth under his arm. "Ask tonight. Come tomorrow with a scarf, even if the day was warm. Our night work on the south slope asks for cooler thinking." Then he went on, and the blue-glazed cups at his side gave a little chime like tiny bells made of water. At supper, Nerin asked, and because her family knew the tone in her voice when curiosity had become something sturdier, they took the question seriously. Ada rested her hands on the edge of the table. "Corinveld?" "Yes," Bella nodded slowly. "The Dew Court is real enough. Neglected, but real. If he invited you, he means to put your hands to work." "I don't mind work." Tisa gave a soft laugh. "No, you mind not knowing where your work belongs." Nerin looked at her, startled by the accuracy. Belan tore bread and dipped it into the lentil pot. "If you go carefully. The contour path has loose edges where the lime crumbles. You do not lean into old reed frames because you think they look interesting. If Corin says the cloth line should not be touched yet, you do not tug it to see why." "I won't," Ada added. "And if he sends you home by moonrise, you come home by moonrise." Nerin nodded eagerly. "Then go," said Ada, "and listen more than you speak at first." The next evening the southern sky was pale gold and lavender when Nerin met Corinveld at the path head. The Dew Walk did not climb directly the way the dawn stair had in the east. Instead it ran in a long, gentle traverse across the warm slope, following the contour line so precisely that it seemed drawn there with a ruler made by patient hands. On one side rose the terraced walls of saffron strips, almond plots and small herb beds edged in stone. On the other side the land fell away toward the village roofs and vineyards below. Every few bends there stood old posts, little plastered niches or low walls that must once have held something more than now remained. At first Nerin heard only the usual evening sounds: doves settling, cicadas still singing, the faint call of women bringing in wash from the courtyard lines. But as they went farther, she began to hear another sound, very soft and irregular. A tap, a drip, a whisper of cloth in the cooling air. "What is that?" she asked. "The slope preparing itself," said Corin. The Dew Court appeared gradually. First came a line of pale plaster walls, not high but long and curving. Then a series of slender cedar frames set between stone posts, each frame holding crossbars and rope loops. Then 3 low domed structures with little north-facing mouths like cool ovens. Then a courtyard paved in pale flagstones open to the evening sky, at the centre of which stood a circular basin surrounded by channels so narrow and fine they looked like carved lines rather than working troughs. Along the basin edge were set dozens of small blue glazed cups, now turned upside down. Around the court grew thyme, rue, silver sage, and night-blooming stock whose fragrance was just beginning to rise. Beyond the court, sloping away into deeper dusk, lay a sequence of narrow nursery beds shaded by reed lattice, 2 fig terraces, and farther still a line of vine cuttings supported by low wicker hoops. Nerin stopped without meaning to. The place was unlike anything she had seen in the valley. It was not ruined exactly. Rather, it had grown quiet from being needed by too few people too seldom. The plaster was cracked in places. Several cloth frames leaned. Some rope lines sagged. One dome mouth had lost part of its shade tile, yet the whole place still held shape and intention. It felt prepared for a task that had simply not been asked of it enough. "What does it do?" she asked at last. Corin set down his bundle. "It gathers the night." Seeing that her face remained blank, he added, "The southern slope loses its heat after sunset. On certain nights, especially after dry days and clear skies, the warm air gives way quickly to cooler breath from the stone shoulders above. Linen stretched over the frames cools. Dew settles. The droplets run to the hems, then to the clay cords, then into the glazed cups and channels. The dome houses keep the cool until dawn. And the basin measures the night's gift. From there it can be given to seed trays, herb starts, saffron bulbs newly laid, vine cuttings, and the small thirsty things that do not need a river, only a mercy." Nerin stared at the frames, imagining them white and shining with night water. "All from dew?" Corin nodded. "Not enough for fields, enough for beginnings, enough for tender roots, enough to spare a cistern turned during lean weeks, enough to remind a valley that slowness feeds it too." He began unrolling the linen. The evening's first work, Nerin learned, was not dramatic. It consisted of checking every frame, every loop, every cord, every cup. Corin showed her how the linen must be stretched so the night air touched it freely, but not so taut that it tore when dampened. He showed her how the little glazed cups were set beneath the lower hems to catch the first run before it entered the channel. He showed her the clay whistle, which was blown only if the north breeze rose too hard and threatened to twist the cloths. He showed her the brass key, which opened the cool domes where the gathered dew was stored in narrow jars until dawn sorting. "Why blue cups?" Nerin asked, turning one gently in her hand. "They hold the cool longer than raw clay," said Corin. "Also, they show dust more honestly." This seemed to Nerin a very good reason. They worked in the softening evening. Cloth was raised, ropes were adjusted. One frame needed a peg hammered back into its stone socket. Another needed nothing but a firmer knot. Corin moved with a kind of quiet intimacy among the objects, as if every pole, hook, cup, and channel had its own temperament and deserved to be approached accordingly. By the time the first stars showed above the mountain shoulder, the cloths were all set. They glowed faintly in the dusk like rows of resting wings. "What now?" Nerin whispered. "Now," said Corin, "we wait with useful eyes." So they sat on the low basin wall while night came. The air changed gradually. That was the first wonder. Not with a gust, not with a drop in temperature one could point to, but with a soft inward release. The day's stored warmth lifted from the stone and passed upward. Cooler air slipped down the slope. The cloth stirred, then settled. The scent of night-blooming stock deepened. Somewhere below, the village lamps appeared one by one. Above, the mountain ridge became a dark, patient shape against the sky. Then, after some time, Nerin heard it. A tiny click, then another, then the faintest dripping into glazed clay. She leaned forward. The cloth nearest them shone along its lower edge. Small clear beads had gathered and were moving together. Corin did not look at her. "There," he said softly. "The slope remembers." Nerin watched as the first drops ran from hem to cord, from cord to cup, from cup to little plaster lip, and into the waiting basin channel. The sound was almost nothing, and because it was almost nothing, it felt larger than rain. She thought suddenly of the twins downstairs, sleeping with their mouths open in the heat, of Ada's dye cloths drying over lines, of Bellon checking hairline cracks in cistern domes, of Tisa saving every fig string to use again. The dew court belonged to that same world of patient keeping, only expressed in night air and cloth. "Why did people stop using it?" she asked in a hush. Corin drew his cloak closer around his shoulders. Because a new spring channel was cut northward, and people preferred larger certainties, because some years were wet enough that the seed beds did not need dew runs, because the cloths tear if neglected, and rope sours and plaster opens and cups crack, and those are unromantic failures, because a generation came who believed only water one can carry by bucket or hear in a channel counts as real. He tilted his head toward the dripping rose, but small real things do not become unreal because they are overlooked. Nerin sat very still with that. She returned the next evening, and many evenings after that. Not every night, because homes and dry slopes both make their demands. Some nights Ada needed her to turn wool in the dye vat or lift the saffron jars down from the upper shelf. Some nights the twins were ill-tempered from heat and could not be trusted not to climb directly into the fig basket. Some nights cloud cover made dew gathering pointless, and Corin sent word through a saffron boy that the cloths would stay rolled. But when the evenings were right, and the household work allowed, Nerin climbed. She learned the dew walk by breath and balance. At sunset the limestone still radiated warmth against the calves. Later it cooled fast enough that a scarf felt good around the throat. The dust on the path smelled of fennel and chalk. Lizards slipped over the warm walls and disappeared into time. The old niches along the way, which she first thought ornamental, thus turned out to be rest points for the cup trays and cord bundles. One low wall at the third bend had once held amphorae of collected dew for the south herb beds. Another sheltered a clay tally slate under an overhang. The path itself had been designed not only to reach the court, but to carry cooled jars down safely before sunrise without jostling or haste. She learned the court too. The domed cool houses were not storage ovens at all, but earthen chambers lined with lime and shaded by north mouths so that the night's collected water remained fresh until distribution. The circular basin had lines marked inside to measure good dew, poor dew, and exceptional dew nights. The little blue cups had slightly different glazes because some were older and some replacements. The cloth frames faced not directly south but a little east of it. Because the night breeze came obliquely down the shoulder, the reed lattices over the nursery beds could be lifted on clear mornings and lowered before noon heat. Every part of the place answered to proportion. She also learned Corin's habits. He carried spare loops, bone needles for the linen hems, a tin of lime paste, beeswax for sticking cracks in small cup rims until proper repair, a whetstone, and always one pear leather strip in his pouch, which he chewed thoughtfully while checking the rope tension. He never left a cup upside down after dawn unless it had been counted. He never crossed the court without glancing at the basin line. On cloudy evenings he swept channels or mended cloth rather than sitting idle. He spoke most while his hands were busy. "What do you see?" he would ask. At first Nerin answered simply, "A frayed hem." Dust in the cup." One rope stretched longer than the rest, the north dome mouth missing a shade tile, but gradually her seeing deepened. A cloth catching too much night wind because the east peg sat half an inch loose, a basin lip leaking into the time bed, a channel carrying faster because its plaster had been smoothed by years of good flow, a frame leaning not from age but from softened footing after a root had pushed under the stone. Each recognition pleased Corin, though his praise was sparing and therefore sweeter. One evening, while sorting old cup trays in the south dome, Nerin found a wrapped packet in a wall niche. It contained a ledger written on reed paper, a little blue glaze shard, and a narrow strip of woven saffron yellow cloth. Corin looked at the packet for a long moment before taking it. "My wife's ledger," he said. Nerin had not heard him speak of a wife before. "Her name was Malice," he said quietly. "She kept the nursery beds and the dye herbs below the court. She knew how much dew each tender root could take before dawn's sun made it foolish. She also said my knots were always too proud." He ran his thumb over the yellow cloth. "This was from her work sash." Nerin waited. The night air in the dome was cool and mineral. Somewhere outside a cup rang lightly as it was set on stone. "Did she help here every night?" Nerin asked at last. "For 30 years," said Corin. "Then less often when her knees argued with the slope. Then not at all when she died. I kept coming because the court still had work, and because some tasks once shared hold their shape better if they are walked a while longer by the one remaining." Nerin thought of her own father then, though she remembered him only in small fragments. Not enough to compare lives, only enough to understand that continuation is sometimes a form of love as clear as any speech. It was in late summer, during a run of dry weeks, that the wider usefulness of the dew court began to matter again. The southern cisterns were not empty. The valley was too careful for that. But the heat had been long, and those who started seedlings for autumn transplanting were beginning to count every dipper. The saffron women asked whether the dew runs were still measurable. A young vine-keeper wanted to know if the nursery cuttings below the court might be revived, if the reed lattice were rehung. A potter's widow, whose glaze herbs had withered on the lower south wall, came to ask, half embarrassed, whether the old dew water might be spared for 2 trays of blue mineral moss if the next clear nights held. Corin listened to all these requests without promise or refusal. Then he said to Nerin, "Now we find whether a forgotten place can speak loudly enough through usefulness." So they began taking notes, not grand records at first, just basin lines, night temperatures by feel, and later by an old metal strip in the dome, cloth dampness, cup counts, channel speed, and the beds that could be served without stealing from another. Nerin learned how to dip the shallow measure spoon into the basin at dawn and judge whether the run was a half gift or a full one. She learned which seedlings needed the first cool water and which could wait until after sunrise shade. She learned that dew, like patience, always is wasted by those who try to pour it too quickly. Belen became involved next, though at first only because Nerin mentioned one evening that the basin lip had 3 hairline cracks, and Corin was patching them with lime too thin for lasting work. Belen, hearing this while trimming a plaster trowel with sandpaper, asked a few questions, then another, then finally said, "I will come tomorrow before dark and look." He did Mawson look. He climbed with a small basket of lime, fine sand, goat hair fibre, and 3 little wooden floats. At the court he knelt by the basin, tapped the plaster edges, examined the cracks, and then turned to Corin with the grave practical courtesy of one craftsman addressing another. This was laid by someone who respected coolness, he said. Corin, who respected few compliments that came coated in fluff, nodded once. Malice's brother. Belen set to work. Nerin held the water bowl and handed the floats. Corin prepared the finer sieve sand. Together they cleaned the cracks, mixed the repair plaster, and pressed it in with such care that the basin seemed to exhale. Belen also reset the missing shade tile on the north dome and patched a corner of channel near the herb run. On the way home in the deep blue dusk, Nerin felt oddly lighter. Belen had not intruded on her new place. He had joined its work. There is a difference, and she felt it more than she could yet say. The restoration spread from there. the saffron women sent old linen lengths to be hemmed into new dew cloths. The potter's widow glazed 6 replacement cups in the old blue and delivered them wrapped in wool scraps. As 2 vineyard brothers reset the lowest frame post in exchange for early use of the dew for their cuttings, Tisa, who had not climbed the path in years, sorted the old cup cords in the courtyard and declared half of them unworthy of another night. Ada dyed 3 narrow-edged stripes on the new cloths, 1 green, 1 saffron, 1 undyed, so that the frame rows could be identified in moonlight without fumbling. Nerin loved these practical gifts more than decorations ever could have pleased her. They meant the court was re-entering the life of the Southern Bowl not as a charming relic, but as something worth supplying with rope, plaster, cloth, glaze, and time. She learned the restoration sequence as thoroughly as she'd learned the climb. Frames first, because cloth must hang true before any gathering matters. Then cups, because what is gathered must have a clean place to arrive. Then channels and basin, because small water deserves as careful a path as large. Then nursery beds and shade lattices, because stored water without roots to receive it is only admired, not used. Then the path, because once a place begins serving again, feet must trust the way to it. The dew walk itself required attention too. Its lower contour edge had crumbled where summer runoff once cut beneath it. 3 niches needed sweeping, and 1 had to be rebuilt on the front lip so jars could be set safely in dawn dimness. The little tally slate house at the third bend had lost its roof board. Beelan and Corin repaired it together while Nerin mixed lime and Ada, who had climbed that day with a dye basket to trade for rosemary. Derud sat on the wall laughing quietly because the 2 men argued over thickness of plaster, as if thickness were a matter of philosophy. By the end of that dry season, the first meaningful distribution of dew water took place. It was not enough to save a vineyard or fill a cistern. No one expected such things. But for 7 clear nights in succession the cloths ran well. The basin line reached the good mark twice, and the fair mark the other nights. At dawn the gathered water was carried in narrow-necked jars to the nursery beds, the saffron starter trays, the blue mineral moss for glaze, the herb seedlings Tisa had coaxed from summer seed, and the vine cuttings on the lower shaded strip. The effect was not instant, and that too was part of the lesson. Nothing sprang upward in a theatrical green. Instead, tiny leaves ceased curling, and seed trays held their colour. The moss remained soft. The vine tips stopped looking weary by noon. People who understood such things noticed, and their noticing travelled. Corin's cloths are gathering again, someone said in the almond groves. The old basin lean held good on 3 nights, said someone else at the saffron sorting tables. I saw Bell and Verrill repairing the dew channels, said the jar merchant to Ada while buying dyed cloth. I suppose that means the south slope has not yet finished with its old inventions. That phrase, old inventions, delighted Nerin. She repeated it to Corin, who said, all useful traditions are old inventions that refuse to stop being clever. By early autumn, more people were using the dew walk itself, not crowds. This was never a road for crowds, but those who climbed it had reasons. A saffron girl carrying bulb trays, the potter's widow bringing glaze herbs in shallow baskets, a vinkeeper checking the cuttings, Ada once or twice with cloths to swap or herbs to dry in the cooler dome mouths, Beelan to inspect a plaster cure, Tisa, astonishingly, one evening at sunset with a basket of figs and a complaint that people twisted cords incorrectly now. The path, here in feet again, seemed to settle into itself. Dust packed where it should. Loose stones were noticed sooner. The niches regained their use. The little chalk marks reappeared on the tally slate. Even the low walls along the contour looked less abandoned when baskets rested on them. One evening, after a particularly fine dew run, Corin opened a chest in the largest dome and showed Nerin a set of little clay discs marked with moons, clouds, and star points. "What are these?" "Dew markers," he said. Malice used them. One for clear nights, one for mixed sky, one for high wind, one for poor drop, one for rich run, one for cloth change, one for basin repair. We used to set them in a sequence on the ledge so anyone coming at dawn knew the night's temper before entering. Nerin touched one of the moon-mark discs reverently. "Will we use them?" "Yes," he said. "A place should speak in its own language when it can." So they began setting the discs. Clear moon for a strong night. Crosswind line for rope adjustments. 2 drops for good run. A little crack mark when Balin was to inspect a channel. Soon people climbing at dawn learned to read the ledge and smiled to see the old symbols returned. Nerin's feeling of being misplaced in her household changed so gradually she only recognised it after it had already altered her days. It began with small things. Ada asking, not, "Can you watch the twins while I finish this?" but, "What did the basin say last night?" Belan leaving a little bag of fine sand by her stool because he knew Corin would need it for the dome mouth. Teaser asking whether the new cloths had been edge-dyed, yet because the green stripe showed night damp better. The twins themselves, hearing so much about cups and cloths and dew, began calling her evening climb going to feed the little water, which was nonsensical and therefore rather perfect. One twilight, while Nerin was tying her scarf before climbing, Belan held out a slender plaster knife with wooden handle worn smooth. "It was my mother's pointing knife," he said. "Good for fine channels and too small for most modern fools. Corin may have better tools, but this one speaks clearly at edges." Nerin took it carefully. The gift felt enormous in its quietness. "Thank you," she said. Belan nodded. "You see small lines now. The tool ought to fit the seeing." She climbed that evening with the knife tucked in her sash and realised halfway up the contour that the dry place inside her, the one that had long wanted one unmistakable basin of its own, no longer felt so empty. It had been filling all along, drop by drop, through attention, through being asked for a specific hand rather than vague helpfulness, through learning that some belonging arrives not with declarations but with entrusted tools. The hardest weeks came not from storm or conflict, but from dull cloud. For almost 10 evenings the southern bowl sat under high, milk-coloured haze. The days were still warm, the nights cooler, but the sky never fully cleared. Dew runs were poor, the basin barely lined. The cloth sagged with disappointment rather than water. The seedlings could not depend on the old court those nights, and the cistern schedules tightened again. Nerin found herself irritated in a way that embarrassed her. She wanted the court to prove itself. She wanted the basin to fill generously, the cups to sing, the village to see plainly what she had come to love. Instead, the sky gave them half gifts and refusals. Corin, seeing her tie a cloth hem too sharply one evening, said, "You're angry with weather." "A little. Why?" "Because we worked so hard. Because now people need it. Because I want it to be enough." Corin hung the cloth more loosely and stepped back to judge the line. Enough does not always mean full. Sometimes it means saving what can be saved while waiting for a clearer night. Nerin pressed her lips together. He glanced at her then, not unkindly. "You think in generous storms and full basins. The dew court thinks in increments. It was built for scarcity with dignity. That is why it matters." The sentence entered her and settled deep. Built for scarcity with dignity. That night the run was poor again. Yet in the morning, when they measured the basin, Corin showed her how even that thin line could still be directed to the weakest tray only, and keep it from being lost. See, he said, not abundance. Continuance. Nerin carried that word home and turned it over all through the day while helping Teaser restring figs, and later while lifting the twins from the cistern wall where they had no business perching. Continuance. It seemed to her suddenly that many of the household's gentlest acts worked the same way. Not grand solutions, not miraculous fullness, just enough, daily, carefully placed. A bench repaired before it split, a child's shirt mended at the shoulder, a fig dried properly, a cistern crack sealed in time, a scarf left on a peg because the evening would turn cool, a man who entered a house slowly enough that grief had room to remain while love made room beside it. Continuance. When the sky finally cleared again, the dew court ran beautifully. The basin reached the high mark just after moonset. The cups filled in a clean line. The channels whispered. At dawn, the air above the court smelled of wet linen, thyme, and cool plaster. Nerin laughed aloud without meaning to, and Corin, who was turning the moon disk over to its rich-run side, allowed himself a smile. News of good dew moves strangely in dry country. It does not spread in exclamations. It spreads through changed decisions. The saffron women brought more trays. The vinekeeper asked whether a second strip of cuttings might be laid. The potter's widow sent thanks wrapped round a little bowl of preserved quince because the glaze moss had survived. Belan proposed replastering the smallest dome entirely before winter. Ada suggested the lower herb terraces might try the old dawn cooling method again if the court held enough nights in sequence. Dawn cooling? Nerin asked. Corin looked pleased she did not know. Tomorrow, he said. Come before sunrise. So for the first time she climbed the dew walk in the pre-dawn dark. The path felt wholly different then. The stones still held a little night cool. The village below was asleep, except for one early lamp in the baker's courtyard. The stars were fading. At the court the cloths hung heavy and silvered. The basin was dark and full enough to show a shallow curve of sky. From the south dome Corin brought out flat glazed tiles that had sat all night in the cool. These go beneath the herb trays for first light, he said. They keep the roots from taking the day's heat too suddenly. They worked in near silence, setting the cool tiles under the trays, turning the lattice slightly east, carrying the best of the gathered dew to the most delicate seedlings. Then, just as the ridge lightened, Corin lowered the cloths and rolled them with swift, practised hands so the first sun would not steal the night's labour back. Nerin looked down from the court. The white roofs of the southern bowl were just emerging. Doves had not yet begun. For a brief moment everything seemed suspended in a hush, made not of waiting, but of completion. This, said Corin softly, was once the most important hour on the south slope. Nerin believed it. As autumn ripened fully, the dew court became part of village speech again, not as legend, not as sentiment, as usefulness. Check with Corin before setting the new cuttings. The basin ran well last night. Send the herb trays. Take the dew walk after supper. The south wall will be cooler by then. Belan says the dome mouth is sound now. We can store 2 extra jars. Even those who never climbed the path knew the cups had been rehung and the cloth frames reset. At night, from lower roofs and vineyard edges, people could see the pale lines of the cloths lifted against the dusk. On some evenings, if the air went very still, the little cup chimes carried faintly all the way down to the village wells. The sound soothed people more than they openly admitted. That year the southern bowl held through a drier late season than expected, Not because of miracle, because the court, the cisterns, the shade lattices, the nursery beds and the households all work together in better measure. The dew court did not replace rain. It did not pretend to. It offered increments, and the valley had relearned the value of increments. One afternoon, after helping Balin replaster the smallest dome, Nerin said, "I used to think the best kind of help was the kind everyone noticed." Balin smoothed the plaster with his float before answering. "And now I think the best kind may be the kind that keeps something alive until others remember to look." Balin sat back on his heels and regarded her with a softness that was not pity, not surprise, simply recognition. "That is a good thing to know at 11, he said. She carried those words with her all evening. Corin, too, began letting the work widen around Nerin. He had always expected her hands to be useful. Now he expected her judgment to be as well. She checked the cloth tension before he did. She counted the cups and marked the ledge discs. She ran the first basin measure at dawn. Sometimes he remained at the lower path bend to speak with a grower while she climbed ahead and opened the domes. Sometimes he asked, "What does the court want tonight?" and waited for her answer. "A tighter east line," she might say. "Why?" "Because the mountain breath is sharper than yesterday and the cloth will slap if it loosens." Or, "No full hanging. The sky isn't clear enough for the upper frames. Better to mend hems instead." Each time he nodded, and each nod settled her more deeply into herself. The year turned. Winter came softer to the southern bowl than to the western gorge, but it still changed everything. Cloths were hung less often. Dew runs became fewer, more precise. The work moved toward maintenance, washing the linen in cool ash water, folding it with lavender against moths, checking cup rims, storing cords, repairing frame sockets, reliming the basin edge. On cold, clear nights, though, the court still gathered a different kind of water, and the winter herb starts were glad of it. The cool season also brought indoor hours in the South Dome, where Corin kept ledgers. These were unlike the time ledgers of the House of Hours and unlike the loading tallies of the bridge route. They were records of clear skies, moon phases, dry spells, basin lines, cloth changes, nursery needs, and the names of households who had received the gathered water in lean seasons. Along the margins were notes in several hands about unusual nights. Wind from the east, poor run after hot stone day, rosemary seedlings resilient, blue moss almost lost, Malice says cups dust faster in fig bloom, Bellin repaired lower lip, Arda's dyed edge visible even in moonless dark. "Is that my mother's name?" Nerin asked once, surprised. Corin pointed. 3 years before you first climbed. She sent cloth scraps for hem patches then, when the old court had nearly gone to sleep. Small help, worth recording. Nerin traced the ink lightly. Another drop in the basin, she thought. By spring, the court and the household had woven together more fully than ever. Tisa sorted the cup cords by thickness. Arda dyed replacement edge bands. Belan inspected every basin crack after a cold night's. The twins, now sturdier and no wiser, marched around the courtyard hanging rags over stools and declaring themselves dew-keepers, until Nerin told them true dew-keepers did not trip over their own feet so often. They considered this a high insult and amended their method only slightly. When the first warm, clear stretch returned, the court opened again in earnest. Nerin carried the old moon disk out to the ledge herself. Corin handed her the key to the smallest dome without comment. The gesture was quiet, almost casual, and therefore immense. It was during that spring that the villagers arranged a shared evening on the south slope, though no one grandly named it a celebration. They simply said that those who had benefited from the court should carry a little food up on the first rich-run week and take the cool there together. So they came at dusk. The saffron women with flat cakes, the potter's widow with herb olives, Beelan with a jar of spring water to taste against the dew water, which the old growers always did out of respect for difference, Arda with dyed cloth spread over a basket of figs, Tisa gloriously determined, with almond sweets and sharp opinions about everyone's knots, the vinkeeper with cuttings that had survived the lean weeks. 2 girls from the herb beds brought sprigs of mint, marjoram and lavender to lay by the basin. Even the twins came, walking most of the way and carried only when the path became steeper than their dignity could bear. The cloths were already raised. The evening air cooled around them. As the stars appeared, the little blue cups began one by one to click and ring. People fell quiet then, not from solemnity, but from listening. Many had not sat beside the court at the actual hour of gathering in years, perhaps ever. They had used what came from it. They had heard about it. But to sit there while the cloth silvered and the first drops found the channels was different. It made the whole slope seem alive in a slow, deliberate way. Nerin looked around and saw faces lit by basin reflections and a low lamp. Arda's calm attention, Belen's slight tiredness from the day's plastering, Tisa's satisfaction hidden under complaint, the twins leaning sleepily against one another, Corin seated near the dome mouth with his hands resting lightly on his knees, as if nothing in the world needed proving. "Is this why you kept coming?" Nerin asked him. Corin watched the cloth nearest them brighten at its hem. This is part of why. A place like this teaches people that not all sustenance arrives in abundance. Some arrives in small, faithful increments that ask to be shared well. He looked toward the basin where the first line was forming, and because malice would not have forgiven me if I let the channels choke. Nerin laughed softly. Summer came again, and with it the richest use of the revived court yet. Seedlings were started earlier because the south growers trusted the dew runs. 2 new nursery strips were laid. The potter's widow's blue moss flourished so well that she made a run of little bowls in the old glaze and sent 6 to the court wrapped in straw. A lower terrace of fig cutting survived a hot spell that would once have ruined them. People began repairing their own small south slope shade systems in imitation of what the court had reminded them. Even the path gained more users. Children with baskets, women with herb trays, a quiet stream of practical evening visitors. Nerin noticed that she no longer climbed seeking a place to fit herself into. She climbed because the place and the work were already partly hers. There is peace in that distinction. One warm night after they had lowered the cloths and sealed the dome jars, Corin sat beside the basin and seemed for once more tired than evening alone could explain. Not alarmingly, only undeniably old. Nerin looked at his hands. "Are your knees bad?" "Sometimes." "Your back?" "Usually." She smiled despite concern. He returned the smile faintly. This is the expected conversation between 11 and 84. They sat together a moment while the night wind moved through the thyme. Then Corin said, "When Malice died, I believe my work was simply to keep coming until I no longer could. That seemed honourable enough. It did not occur to me that the court might ask not for endurance alone, but for continuation." Nerin was very still. He reached into his pouch and drew out the brass key. Not the small dome key Belan had seen him use. The heavier key with the longer bow that opened the main cool chamber, the ledger shelf and the basin valve box. "I am not done," he said. "Do not mistake me. I like correcting your knots too much to vanish yet." but a key kept in one pocket too long forgets the shape of other hands. He laid it on the basin edge between them. Nerin looked at it, then at him. "You mean me to keep it?" "I mean you to begin keeping it with me." The words entered her like cool water. She picked up the key. The brass held the warmth of the day and the cool of the dome together. From then on the work changed again, though gently. On clear evenings, Nerin sometimes climbed first to check the cloth lines, while Corin followed more slowly with the cup trays. On cloudy nights he sent her to inspect the nursery shade while he remained to mend hems. When a new grower came uncertain of the ledge discs, it was often Nerin who explained them. When Balan inspected a crack or Ada sent new cloth edge bands, they asked her where the need was greatest. The twins, growing taller, now came as far as the third niche and carried empty cup trays back down like solemn porters. The south bowl had grown used to seeing the court alive again. At dusk, pale cloth showed on the slope where once there had been only leaning frames. At dawn, narrow-necked jars sometimes moved down the contour path in careful hands. On still nights the small blue cups answered the cool air with delicate sounds that floated over the white roofs and vine walls. People heard them while covering bread dough, mending baskets, closing shutters, or laying children to sleep, and the sound told them something quiet and important. The night was being gathered. In later years, when people in the southern bowl spoke of that season, they would remember the court's return as if it had always been waiting just beyond attention. Perhaps it had. Old useful places often do wait that way, not dramatically, not bitterly, simply holding their form as long as they can until someone comes back with cloth, plaster, rope, bowls, and the willingness to learn small increments. For now, though, Nerin was still 11, becoming 12, still climbing in the evening with scarf at her throat and the plaster knife at her sash, still learning how much one can change by attending to things that move slowly. She'd once thought that thirst was answered best by rain. The dew court taught her otherwise. Some thirsts are answered by drops gathered faithfully in the dark. Some homes are steadied by little repeated kindnesses. Some hearts, uncertain where to pour themselves, find their place not in dramatic floods of feeling, but in the cool, patient work of catching what might otherwise be lost. So the southern bowl of the valley went on in its white, fragrant rhythm. Doves settled on roof edges, dye cloths dried under pergolas. Saffron was sorted in warm hands, clay jars cooled in domed cistern rooms. The dew walk curved along the slope, its niches swept, its path held, its low walls warm by day and cool by night. The dew court raised its linen wings at evening, listened to the mountain breath descend, and fed the basin drop by drop until the dark itself seemed to be giving water. And if villagers looked up from their courtyards after sunset, they might see two figures moving among the pale cloths. One was older, lean and steady, walking with the hook staff and the patience of long years. The other was smaller, quicker still but no longer hurried, lifting cups, checking lines, and carrying the basin key on a cord beneath her scarf. The sight reassured them in ways they would not always have explained aloud. It told them the cloths had been raised, that the channels were open, that the seed trays, the cuttings, the herbs, and the tender small things had not been forgotten, that the south slope, dry and listening as ever, still knew how to gather enough. And in the whitewashed house below, where figs hung from strings in the back room and indigo cloth cooled by the cistern, Nerin slept with a peace she had not known before the dew walk opened to her. She belonged not because someone had announced her importance, nor because she had made herself useful in every corner at once, but because she had learned the art of placing small care where it would matter most. Outside, the night air slipped down from the mountain shoulder. The cloth shone faintly. The blue cups clicked. Somewhere on the south slope, little runnels of gathered water made their quiet way into the basin, then into jars, then into roots that would greet the dawn a little less thirsty than before, and the valley, patient in all its arms, kept another gentle night.